The words hit Eleanor like a thunderclap in the Wyoming dust. I don't need a servant, I need a wife. Her trembling hands stilled, her desperate plea for work hanging in the air between them. The tall cowboy's sky-blue eyes held no mockery, only a quiet intensity that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. She'd fled 1,000 miles to escape one man's claim on her future, only to find herself facing another man's unexpected proposition at the edge of nowhere. But as the autumn wind howled across Cedar Bluff Ranch and her empty stomach twisted with hunger, Eleanor Graves realized she was out of options, out of time, and out of places to run. If you want to see how Eleanor's desperate gamble transforms into something neither she nor Caleb could have imagined, stay with me until the very end of this story. And please, drop a comment with your city or country. I'd love to see how far this tale of courage and second chances travels across the world. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly before Eleanor Graves, a canvas of amber grass and distant purple mountains that seemed to mock her exhaustion with their impossible beauty. Every step sent sharp pains shooting through her blistered feet, and the thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders did nothing against the October wind that cut through her worn traveling dress like a knife through butter. 3 days. 3 days since she'd jumped from that train while it slowed near the water tower. 3 days of walking, hiding, and praying that no one from St. Louis had followed her this far west. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep crimson, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure because it meant another night was coming, and she had no shelter, no food, and no plan beyond the desperate hope that had sustained her since she'd fled her stepfather's house in the dead of night. Her vision swam as she crested another low hill, and for a moment she thought the structure before her was a mirage born of desperation and dehydration. But no. There it stood, solid and real. A weathered wooden gate flanked by posts that had seen better days, and above it, a sign carved with words she could barely make out through her exhausted tears. Cedar Bluff Ranch. Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle. A ranch meant people. People meant the possibility of work, of food, of somewhere, anywhere, to rest her weary body and racing mind. She gripped the top rail of the gate to steady herself, her refined hands, still soft despite days of rough travel, trembling against the sun-bleached wood. Beyond the gate, she could see buildings. A large barn with red paint peeling from its sides, a modest house with a covered porch, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved like liquid shadows in the fading light. Smoke rose from the house's chimney, a sight so domestic and normal it made her chest ache with longing for a safety she'd never truly known. You can do this, she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. You have to do this. She pushed open the gate, wincing as its hinges screamed in protest, announcing her presence to anyone within earshot. The sound echoed across the ranch yard like a gunshot, and Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear into the gathering dusk before anyone could see her, question her, or worse, send word back east about a runaway girl with auburn hair and green eyes who was worth a substantial reward to the right people. But running had brought her here, to this moment, to this last desperate chance. She couldn't run anymore. Eleanor forced her feet forward, each step a small victory over the terror that threatened to send her fleeing back into the wilderness. The yard was well kept despite its weathered appearance. Tools hung neatly on the barn wall, the fences were mended and sturdy, and the hard-packed earth showed signs of regular sweeping. This was a working ranch, maintained by someone who took pride in their property, even if they couldn't afford fresh paint. She was halfway across the yard when the barn door swung open. The man who emerged was tall, taller than her stepfather, taller than any of the St. Louis gentlemen who'd come calling with their oily smiles and calculating eyes. He wore working clothes, dark trousers, a shirt with sleeves rolled to reveal forearms tanned and corded with muscle, a leather vest, and boots that had seen hard use. A hat shadowed his face as he paused, one hand still on the barn door, clearly surprised to find a stranger in his yard. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor stood frozen, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her dress torn and stained, her hair escaping its pins in wild tangles, her face undoubtedly streaked with dust and desperation. She'd rehearsed what she would say if she found a ranch, practiced the words 100 times as she walked. But now, faced with this silent stranger, every carefully planned phrase fled her mind. The man let the barn door swing closed behind him and took a few steps forward, bringing him into the slanting golden light of the dying sun. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, maybe a few years older, with features carved by sun and wind and what looked like years of hard living. His jaw was strong, shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and his cheekbones were high and sharp. But it was his eyes that held her, sky blue, the color of a summer morning, assessing her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and strangely seen, not judged, just seen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the space between them. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so instinctively polite it made Eleanor's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Can I help you?" The kindness in those 4 words nearly broke her. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred, and she realized with horror that she was crying, not delicate tears that could be dabbed away with a handkerchief, but great gasping sobs that shook her entire body as weeks of terror, exhaustion, and desperation finally overwhelmed her careful control. "I'm sorry," she managed to choke out between sobs. "I'm so sorry. Her knees buckled. The cowboy moved faster than she would have thought possible for a man his size, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. Strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her before she could fall. He held her carefully, as if she were made of glass, his touch firm but gentle. "Easy now," he said, his voice closer now, calm and steady as a heartbeat. "When did you last eat, ma'am?" I don't... Eleanor tried to remember. Yesterday? The day before? She'd had a few berries she'd found near a creek, and before that half a stale roll she'd saved from the train. "I don't know." The man's jaw tightened, and something that might have been anger flashed through his blue eyes, but she sensed instinctively it wasn't directed at her. "Can you walk to the house?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He didn't release her arms immediately, studying her face with those unsettling eyes as if trying to read a story written there. "I'm Caleb Ward," he said. "This is my ranch. You're safe here, understand?" Safe. The word was a foreign language, a concept so distant Eleanor could barely remember what it felt like. But something in the way he said it, the quiet certainty in his voice, made her want to believe him. "Eleanor," she whispered. "My name is Eleanor." "Well, Miss Eleanor, let's get some food in you before we worry about anything else." He guided her toward the house, his hand hovering near her elbow, ready to catch her if she stumbled but not quite touching, giving her space to preserve her dignity, even in her desperate state. The porch steps seemed insurmountable, but Eleanor forced her trembling legs to climb them. Caleb opened the door and ushered her inside. The house's interior was simple but clean, a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. A hallway led to what she assumed were bedrooms. The space had the peculiar emptiness of a place lived in by someone who'd stopped caring about comfort or decoration, functional and austere, with none of the small touches that made a house a home. "Sit," Caleb said, pulling out a chair at the table. Eleanor sank into it gratefully, her legs finally giving up their rebellion. She watched as Caleb moved to the stove, his movements economical and practiced. He stirred something in a pot, stew by the smell of it, then sliced thick pieces from a loaf of bread that looked a day or 2 old, but infinitely appealing to her starving senses. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a tin on a shelf. "Yes, please, thank you." The words tumbled out, her mother's training in proper etiquette surfacing even through her exhaustion. Caleb set a tin plate before her, the stew still steaming, the bread slathered with butter that was already melting into golden pools. Eleanor's stomach clenched painfully at the sight, and she had to force herself not to fall on the food like a wild animal. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon. "Go on," Caleb said quietly, pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "Eat slow, or you'll make yourself sick." It was the hardest thing Eleanor had ever done, taking small bites when every fiber of her being screamed to devour everything on the plate. The stew was simple: beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, but it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever been served in her stepfather's grand dining room. She forced herself to chew slowly, to breathe between bites, to sip the strong, bitter coffee that Caleb set beside her plate. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching her with those unsettling blue eyes. Eleanor knew she should feel uncomfortable under such scrutiny, but somehow she didn't. He wasn't looking at her the way men in St. Louis had looked at her, calculating her worth, assessing her usefulness, undressing her with their eyes. He was simply watching, waiting. When she'd eaten half the stew and one piece of bread, her stomach began to protest, stretched too tight after days of near emptiness. Eleanor set down her spoon reluctantly, knowing she should eat more but unable to force another bite. "That's good," Caleb said, pushing off from the counter. "You can have more later, once your stomach settles." He refilled her coffee cup, then finally pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his large frame making the chair look almost comically small. "Now, you want to tell me what brings a lady with an Eastern accent and hands soft as butter to my ranch, looking like she's been running from the devil himself?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the coffee mug. She'd known the questions would come, but she hadn't prepared answers, not real ones. What could she say? That she was fleeing an arranged marriage to a man who'd looked at her like a prize horse? That her stepfather had threatened to lock her in her room until the wedding? That she'd stolen money from his desk and run like a thief in the night? "I need work," she said instead, forcing her voice to steady. "I can clean. I can cook. I can sew and do laundry and keep a garden. I'm educated. I can read and write and do sums. I'll work hard, Mr. Ward. I promise you won't regret hiring me." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "That's so. You got references? Papers? Anyone who can vouch for your character and work history?" Eleanor's heart sank. "No, sir. I don't." He took a sip of his own coffee, still watching her over the rim of the cup. "And I suppose you've got a perfectly reasonable explanation for why a well-bred Eastern lady ends up in Wyoming territory without references, luggage, or anything but the clothes on her back?" She said nothing. What could she say? Caleb set down his cup with a soft clink. "Here's what I see, Miss Eleanor. I see a woman running from something, not running to something. I see someone who's educated and refined, probably from a good family, but who's willing to beg for work at a ranch in the middle of nowhere. I see someone who's scared enough to risk dying in the wilderness rather than face whatever she left behind." Eleanor's throat tightened. She met his eyes, expecting to see judgment or worse, the calculating look of someone who'd figured out she might be worth something to the right people. But she saw only a quiet understanding that was somehow worse than judgment. "I'm not a criminal," she whispered. "I haven't hurt anyone. I couldn't stay where I was. I couldn't. And where was that?" "St. Louis." Caleb let out a low whistle. "That's a fair distance to run." "Not far enough," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of horses moving in the corrals outside. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, to not look away, to not give in to the urge to dissolve into tears again. Finally, Caleb pushed back from the table and stood. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Eleanor." Her stomach clenched. Here it came. The price for his kindness, the real cost of the food she'd just eaten. She'd been foolish to hope for anything different. Men always wanted something. "I don't need a servant," Caleb said, his voice calm and steady. "I need a wife." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard, that exhaustion had finally addled her mind completely. "What?" "A wife," Caleb repeated, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "Someone to help run this place, to cook and manage the house, to stand beside me as a partner, not a servant, not a hired girl who'll run off as soon as something better comes along. A wife." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Of all the things she'd expected, propositions of a different sort, demands for payment, even outright rejection, this had never crossed her mind. You You can't be serious. I'm always serious, Miss Eleanor. Caleb crossed his arms, leaning back against the counter again. Been running this ranch alone for 3 years since my brother died. It's hard work for 2 people, near impossible for one. I need help, and I need it to be permanent. I need someone I can trust to be here, to work alongside me, to build something lasting. But you don't even know me! Eleanor's voice rose, edging toward hysteria. I could be anyone. I could be... You're someone who'd rather risk death than go back to wherever you came from, Caleb interrupted, his voice cutting through her panic like a knife. You're someone with enough grit to walk across Wyoming territory alone. You're someone who says thank you even when you're half-starved and scared out of your mind. He paused, his blue eyes pinning her to her chair. And you're someone who needs a place to disappear, same as I'm someone who needs a partner he can count on. Seems like maybe we could help each other. Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was insane. This was completely, utterly insane. She'd fled one arranged marriage only to have another proposed over stew and coffee by a stranger in the middle of nowhere. But this stranger had fed her without asking for payment, had steadied her when she nearly fell, had offered safety without conditions, had looked at her and seen a person, not a commodity. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you marry someone you just met? Surely there are women in town, women you know, women who... Women in town know me, Caleb said, and for the first time something that might have been pain crossed his face. Know my history, know what happened 3 years ago. They've made it clear they're not interested, and I'm done begging for scraps of attention from people who've already decided I'm not worth their time. There was a story there, Eleanor realized. A painful one. She recognized the look in his eyes because she'd seen it in her own mirror, the look of someone who'd been judged and found wanting, someone who'd learned to expect rejection. What happened 3 years ago? She asked softly. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's a story for another time. Right now, we need to figure out what happens next. He pushed off from the counter and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening ranch yard. Here's what I'm offering. You stay here. 2 weeks, no obligations. You help around the house, see how you like the work, see if you can stand living in the middle of nowhere with nothing but wind and cattle for company. At the end of 2 weeks, if you want to move on, I'll give you money for a train ticket anywhere you want to go, and I'll forget I ever saw you. And if I stay? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Caleb turned from the window, and the last rays of sunlight streaming through the glass turned his eyes into chips of brilliant blue ice. If you stay, we get married, proper and legal. You become Eleanor Ward, mistress of Cedar Bluff Ranch, and you get my name and my protection. No one will touch you or take you anywhere you don't want to go. In return, you help me run this place. You cook, you clean, you manage the house and gardens. We work together as partners. And Eleanor's voice caught. She forced herself to ask the question burning in her mind. And what else would you expect from a wife? Understanding dawned in Caleb's eyes, followed by something that looked almost like respect. I expect honesty, hard work, and loyalty. I expect a partner who'll stand with me, not behind me. As for, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, the other aspects of marriage, that would be your choice. I'm not looking for a bedmate I have to coerce, Miss Eleanor. I'm looking for a partner I can trust. The rest, if it happens, happens in its own time when both parties are willing, or it doesn't happen at all. Either way, you'd have a home and a name and legal protection that no one could take from you. It was, Eleanor realized with a shock, the most honest proposal of marriage she'd ever heard. Her stepfather's arrangement had been couched in pretty words about security and advancement, but it had been nothing more than a business transaction. This was still a transaction, but at least Caleb was being honest about the terms. Why? She asked, needing to understand. Why offer this to a stranger? You said yourself I could be anyone. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him. Because I know what it's like to need an escape. I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control and to have doors slam in your face everywhere you turn. I know what it's like to be alone in a way that eats at you like acid. He met her eyes across the dimming room. And because something in my gut tells me you're good people who got dealt a bad hand. My gut's kept me alive in some tight spots, Miss Eleanor. I've learned to trust it." Eleanor's throat burned with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she'd been fooled before by kind words and promises that turned to ash. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Caleb nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "You can sleep in the barn loft tonight. It's clean and dry, and there's blankets up there. In the morning, you can give me your answer about the 2 weeks. After that, well, we'll see." "The barn?" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Caleb's expression was gentle but firm. "You're an unmarried woman, Miss Eleanor, and I'm an unmarried man. Whatever arrangement we come to, your reputation, such as it is out here, will be protected while you're under my roof. The barn's warm enough, and come morning, my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will be here. She comes 3 times a week to help with the heavy work. She'll be a proper chaperone until we sort things out." The fact that he was concerned about propriety when he'd just proposed marriage to a stranger would have been laughable if it wasn't so unexpectedly touching. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Caleb lit a lantern and handed it to her. "Come on, I'll show you where you can bed down." They walked across the darkened yard in silence, the lantern casting wild shadows that danced across the weathered buildings. The barn smelled of hay and horses and leather, clean animal smells that were oddly comforting. Caleb led her to a ladder at the back. "Up there," he said, gesturing to the loft. "There's blankets in the chest, and the hay's fresh. If you need anything in the night, the house is right there. Don't be shy about knocking." Eleanor climbed the ladder, her tired muscles protesting every rung. The loft was exactly as he described, clean and dry, with sweet-smelling hay piled in one corner and a wooden chest pushed against the wall. She set the lantern down and opened the chest, finding wool blankets that smelled of cedar. "Miss Eleanor?" Caleb's voice drifted up from below. "Yes?" "Whatever you're running from, whoever you're running from, they won't find you here. I give you my word on that." Before she could respond, she heard his footsteps retreating across the barn floor. The door creaked open and closed, and then she was alone with the horses shifting in their stalls below and the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. Eleanor sank onto the hay and let herself cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her mother, dead these 5 years. She cried for her lost innocence and her stolen choices. She cried for the girl she'd been before her stepfather had shown his true colors. And she cried for the impossible situation she found herself in now, caught between the devil she'd fled and the unknown future offered by a strange cowboy with sad blue eyes. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor wrapped herself in the wool blankets and lay back in the hay. Through the loft's small window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. More stars than she'd ever seen in St. Louis, a river of light stretching across the heavens. "I don't need a servant, I need a wife." The words echoed in her mind as exhaustion finally dragged her toward sleep. It was insane, impossible, completely, utterly mad. But what choice did she have? She could take Caleb Ward up on his offer of 2 weeks and a train ticket, try to disappear into some western town where her stepfather's reach might not extend. But she had no money, no skills that would earn her enough to survive, and no references that wouldn't lead straight back to St. Louis. Or she could stay. She could become Eleanor Ward, wife of a Wyoming rancher, and disappear into a new identity so completely that no one from her old life would ever find her. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor realized with a strange clarity that she'd already made her decision. She'd made it the moment Caleb Ward had looked at her with those blue eyes and offered her not charity, not pity, but a partnership. She'd made it when he'd spoken of protection and choice and honesty. She would take his 2 weeks. And at the end of them, if he still wanted her, and if the ranch was half as good as it seemed in the twilight, she would become his wife. Not because she loved him, how could she? She didn't even know him. But because sometimes survival meant making impossible choices, and because maybe, just maybe, in the wild emptiness of Wyoming territory, 2 broken people could build something whole. The wind howled around the barn, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote sang its lonely song. Eleanor pulled the blankets tighter and closed her eyes, dreaming of sky-blue eyes and words that promised safety she'd almost forgotten existed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Eleanor Graves slept in a place where someone had promised she was safe. And that, for now, was enough. Morning arrived with the rooster's crow that shattered Eleanor's dreamless sleep like a hammer through glass. She jolted upright, disoriented and aching, hay stuck to her hair and the rough wool blanket twisted around her legs. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The ranch, the cowboy, the impossible proposal. Pale sunlight streamed through the loft window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor pushed the blanket aside and stood, her muscles screaming in protest. 3 days of walking had taken their toll, and sleeping on hay, comfortable as it had seemed in her exhaustion, had left her stiff and sore. She brushed hay from her dress and tried to finger-comb her tangled hair into something resembling respectability, knowing it was a lost cause. The ladder down from the loft seemed steeper in daylight, and Eleanor descended carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her full weight. The barn below was alive with morning activity. Horses nickering softly in their stalls, barn cats weaving between posts in search of their breakfast, dust motes dancing in the slanting light. It was peaceful in a way that made her chest ache with longing for a life she'd never had. She found the door and stepped out into the ranch yard, squinting against the brightness. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, so blue it hurt to look at, without a single cloud to mar its perfection. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine and something indefinable that she would later come to recognize as simply the smell of Wyoming, vast and wild and utterly untamed. A woman's voice, sharp with surprise, cut through the morning stillness. "Well, I'll be. Who in the devil are you?" Eleanor spun to find a small, wiry woman standing near the house, a basket of laundry balanced on one hip. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, weathered brown skin that spoke of mixed heritage, and dark eyes that assessed Eleanor with the kind of thorough scrutiny usually reserved for livestock at auction. She wore a simple dress covered by a white apron, both spotlessly clean despite the early hour. My name is Eleanor. Eleanor Graves." Eleanor smoothed her ruined dress self-consciously, acutely aware of how she must look, disheveled, dirty, sleeping in a barn like some vagrant. "Mr. Ward said his housekeeper would be here this morning. Mrs. Chen?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "That'd be me. And Caleb didn't mention anything about a girl sleeping in his barn when I left 3 days ago. I arrived yesterday evening. I was looking for work, and Mr. Ward offered me—" Eleanor trailed off, unsure how to explain the situation without sounding completely insane. "Offered you what exactly?" Mrs. Chen set down her laundry basket, crossing her arms in a gesture that would have done any general proud. "Because Caleb Ward is a good man, and I won't stand by while some city girl takes advantage of his kind nature." Before Eleanor could formulate a response that wouldn't make everything worse, the house door opened and Caleb emerged onto the porch. He'd shaved since last night, revealing the strong lines of his jaw, and changed into a clean shirt, though he still wore the same vest and boots. His eyes found Eleanor immediately, and something in his expression softened. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said easily, descending the porch steps. "I see you've met Miss Eleanor." "Met her sleeping in your barn, you mean?" Mrs. Chen retorted, her tone sharp enough to cut steel. "What in the name of all that's holy are you thinking, Caleb? An unmarried woman staying on your property without a proper chaperone? Do you want to give the town gossips more ammunition than they already have?" "Miss Eleanor needed help," Caleb said simply, coming to stand beside Eleanor in a gesture that felt surprisingly protective. "She's staying for 2 weeks, helping around the house. In return, she gets room and board and a train ticket at the end if she decides to move on." Mrs. Chen's sharp gaze moved between them, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "And if she doesn't move on? Then we'll discuss other arrangements." Caleb's tone was calm but firm, the tone of a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed. "For now, she's a guest and employee, and she'll be treated with respect. I expect you to help her settle in and show her how things run around here." For a long moment, Mrs. Chen studied them both with those penetrating dark eyes. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, the older woman's expression softened fractionally. "Fine, but She's sleeping in the house, in the spare room, not in that barn like some stray cat. I won't have it said I allowed impropriety under this roof, arrangements or no arrangements. That's fair, Caleb agreed, looking relieved. Can you set her up in there today? Already planning on it. Mrs. Chen turned to Eleanor, her gaze slightly less hostile but still assessing. You eaten yet, girl? Eleanor shook her head. Figured as much. Come on then. Let's get some breakfast into you, and then we'll see what you're actually capable of. If you're going to eat Caleb's food, you're going to earn your keep proper. Eleanor followed Mrs. Chen toward the house, acutely aware of Caleb's presence behind them. The housekeeper led them into the kitchen, which looked different in daylight, less austere, more simply functional. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, already radiating heat. Copper pots hung from hooks, and shelves lined with jars of preserved food spoke to long winters and careful planning. Sit, Mrs. Chen commanded, pointing Eleanor toward the table. You too, Caleb. Don't think I didn't notice you skipped supper last night to give your portions to her. Caleb had the grace to look slightly sheepish as he took a seat across from Eleanor. Mrs. Chen moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of long practice, cracking eggs into a pan, slicing more of that day-old bread, pouring coffee that smelled strong enough to strip paint. So, Mrs. Chen said, her back to them as she worked, you going to tell me the real story? Or are we all going to pretend this is a normal hiring situation? Caleb glanced at Eleanor, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny nod. If she was going to stay here, even for 2 weeks, these people deserved some version of the truth. I'm from St. Louis, Eleanor said quietly. My mother died 5 years ago, and I've been living with my stepfather. He arranged a marriage for me, to a man I couldn't stomach. So I ran. Mrs. Chen turned from the stove, spatula in hand, her expression unreadable. Ran all the way to Wyoming? I got on a train heading west. I didn't have a destination, just away. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I jumped off when the train slowed for water. I've been walking for 3 days. This was the first ranch I came to. Lucky for you it was this ranch, Mrs. Chen muttered, turning back to the eggs. Half the men in this territory would have taken advantage of a girl in your situation. I know. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen plated the eggs with swift, economical movements, adding thick slices of bread fried in butter and strips of bacon that must have come from the smokehouse Eleanor had noticed behind the barn. She set the plates before them with enough force to make them rattle. Eat, she commanded. Both of you, and while you're eating, Caleb Ward, you're going to explain to me exactly what arrangements you're planning to discuss at the end of 2 weeks. Caleb took a bite of eggs, clearly stalling. Eleanor watched him, curious despite herself about how he would explain his bizarre proposal to his obviously protective housekeeper. Finally, Caleb set down his fork and met Mrs. Chen's eyes squarely. I asked Miss Eleanor to marry me. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows shot up so fast Eleanor was surprised they didn't leave her face entirely. You what? I asked her to marry me, Caleb repeated, his voice steady. I need a partner to help run this place, and she needs protection and a new name. Seemed like a practical solution to both our problems. Practical, Mrs. Chen repeated, her tone suggesting Caleb had lost his mind. You think marriage is practical, like buying a new plow or fixing a fence? Why not? Caleb's jaw set stubbornly. That's how half the marriages out here happen anyway. People need partners, people need help. They make arrangements that benefit both parties. Those people usually court for more than 5 minutes over a bowl of stew. I don't have time for courting, Mrs. Chen. The ranch needs help now, not after months of proper calling cards and chaperoned walks. Caleb's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through his usual calm. I've tried the traditional way. I've been polite. I've been patient. And you know as well as I do how that worked out. Mrs. Chen's expression softened, and she reached out to pat Caleb's hand, a gesture so maternal it made Eleanor's throat tighten. I know, boy. I know what they've done to you in town, but rushing into marriage with a stranger isn't the answer. Maybe not, Caleb acknowledged. That's why I gave her 2 weeks. 2 weeks to see if she can stand it here. 2 weeks for both of us to see if this could work. If it can't, I'll give her money to start fresh somewhere else, and we'll both move on. Mrs. Chen turned her assessing gaze to Eleanor. And what do you say to all this, girl? You really considering marrying a man you just met? Eleanor set down her coffee cup carefully, buying herself a moment to find the right words. Mrs. Chen, 3 days ago, I had two choices. Marry a man who looked at me like I was property he'd purchased, or run. I chose to run knowing full well I might die in the attempt. Yesterday, when I arrived here, I was out of food, out of strength, and out of options. She met the older woman's eyes steadily. Mr. Ward offered me a third choice. Maybe it's not conventional, maybe it's not romantic, but it's honest, and it's my decision to make. That's more than I had before. Silence settled over the kitchen, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the stove and the distant lowing of cattle. Mrs. Chen studied Eleanor for a long moment, then surprised her by nodding slowly. All right, she said. All right, I still think you're both crazy as bedbugs, but I can't fault your reasoning. She turned to Caleb. 2 weeks. She stays in the spare room. I'm here as chaperone as much as possible. And if I see you taking advantage of this situation in any way, Caleb Ward, I'll take a frying pan to your head. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Caleb said, looking relieved. And you, Mrs. Chen fixed Eleanor with a stern look. You pull your weight. I don't care if you're a guest or a potential bride or the Queen of Sheba herself. If you eat at this table, you work. I'll teach you what you need to know, but I expect you to learn fast and work hard. This isn't some finishing school where you sit around embroidering pillowcases. I understand, Eleanor said, and meant it. Hard work didn't scare her. She'd run a household staff for her stepfather, planned dinners for 20, managed accounts and correspondence. Surely she could handle the work of a ranch house. She was about to discover how very wrong that assumption was. After breakfast, Mrs. Chen put Eleanor to work with the kind of ruthless efficiency that would have impressed a military commander. First came the dishes, which seemed simple enough until Eleanor realized the water had to be hauled from the pump outside, heated on the stove, and that Mrs. Chen expected them washed, dried, and put away properly. Not just rinsed and stacked like the servants had done in St. Louis when they thought no one was watching. Then came the floors, which needed sweeping and scrubbing. Eleanor had never scrubbed a floor in her life, and her back was screaming within minutes of kneeling beside the bucket of hot water and lye soap. Mrs. Chen watched her struggle for exactly 30 seconds before clicking her tongue in exasperation. Like this, she said, dropping to her knees with surprising grace for a woman her age. Long strokes. Use your shoulders, not your arms. Keep the brush moving steady. You're not scratching a cat's belly, you're cleaning a floor. Eleanor tried to copy the older woman's movements, her hands already red from the hot water and harsh soap. The physical labor was harder than anything she'd done in her carefully cultivated life of social calls and needlework. But there was something satisfying about it, too. Watching the water turn gray with dirt, seeing the floorboards emerge clean and golden from beneath years of accumulated grime. By midday, Eleanor's hands were blistered. Her back ached like she'd been beaten, and she'd discovered muscles she never knew existed. Mrs. Chen had also put her to work beating rugs, washing windows, and scrubbing out the cupboards, tasks that seemed endless and Sisyphean. The house, which had seemed merely austere the night before, revealed itself as a place that had been neglected, maintained just barely enough to be functional, but showing the clear signs of a man living alone without the energy or inclination for proper housekeeping. When did Caleb's brother die? Eleanor asked during a brief break, her hands wrapped around a cup of water she'd pumped herself from the well. Mrs. Chen paused in her own work, her expression growing somber. 3 years ago this November. James was the younger brother, 22 years old and full of fire. They were breaking horses together, something they'd done 1,000 times. But that day, a rattlesnake spooked the mare, and James got thrown. Landed wrong. Eleanor's breath caught. He died in front of Caleb? Not right away. Took him 3 days. Internal injuries, the doctor said. Nothing anyone could do but watch him fade. Mrs. Chen's voice was thick with old grief. Caleb blamed himself. Still does, though it wasn't his fault. Just bad luck and worse timing. That must have been terrible. It was, but what came after was worse, in some ways. Mrs. Chen returned to washing the window she'd been working on, her strokes harder than necessary. There was a girl in town, Sarah Blackwood, the banker's daughter, pretty as a picture and sweet as honey, or so everyone thought. She'd been stepping out with Caleb for near on a year. Everyone expected them to marry. What happened? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Week after James died, while Caleb was still half mad with grief, Sarah broke things off. Told him she couldn't marry a man who ran a ranch alone, that she needed stability and security, that she was sorry but she had to think of her future. Mrs. Chen's mouth twisted. A month later, she was engaged to Thomas Crawford, who owns the mercantile in town. Nice, safe job, no danger of dying from a horse accident. Eleanor felt a surge of anger on behalf of a man she barely knew. That's horrible. That's practical, Mrs. Chen said, echoing Caleb's earlier word with a bitter twist. At least that's what Sarah called it. Most folks in town agreed with her, said Caleb was reckless, that ranching was too dangerous, that he'd end up getting himself killed same as his brother. They stopped inviting him to socials, stopped calling on him, treated him like he was already dead. She turned to face Eleanor fully. That's why I'm protective of him, girl. Because Caleb Ward is one of the best men I've ever known, and this territory has kicked him in the teeth every chance it gets. I won't stand by and watch someone else hurt him, even if she doesn't mean to. I don't want to hurt him, Eleanor said quietly. I just want a chance to survive. Sometimes those two things are the same, Mrs. Chen said, but her tone was gentler. Just remember, if you stay, if you marry him, you're not just getting a name and protection. You're getting a man with a bruised heart who's offering you a partnership because he's too scared to risk offering anything more. You treat that carefully, hear me? I will, Eleanor promised, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was promising. The afternoon brought new challenges. Mrs. Chen announced it was bread baking day, and Eleanor found herself elbow-deep in flour and yeast, trying to knead dough that seemed determined to stick to everything except the kneading board. Her arms burned, her hands ached, and the dough looked nothing like the smooth, elastic ball Mrs. Chen's experienced hands had produced. You're fighting it, Mrs. Chen said, watching Eleanor wrestle with the sticky mass. Bread's like people. You try to force it, it'll resist. You work with it gentle but firm, it'll do what you need. Eleanor tried to adjust her technique, pushing and folding like Mrs. Chen demonstrated. Slowly, grudgingly, the dough began to cooperate. When she finally managed to shape it into something resembling a proper ball, the satisfaction she felt was entirely disproportionate to the accomplishment, but real nonetheless. While the bread rose, Mrs. Chen put Eleanor to work in the kitchen garden, which was overgrown with weeds and clearly hadn't been properly tended in months. They worked side by side in the autumn sun, Eleanor learning to distinguish weeds from the last struggling vegetables, learning which plants could be saved and which needed to be pulled entirely. You're a hard worker, I'll give you that, Mrs. Chen said as they worked, and Eleanor felt an absurd flush of pride at the simple praise. Soft hands, but you're not afraid to get them dirty. That's something. Caleb appeared at the garden gate as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, his shirt dusty and his face tired. Eleanor had barely seen him all day. He'd been working with the cattle, riding the fence lines, doing the 1,000 tasks required to keep a ranch running. Now he leaned against the gatepost, watching them work with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Getting settled in? He asked Eleanor. She sat back on her heels, acutely aware of how she must look. Hair escaping its pins, face flushed with exertion, dress stained with dirt and flour and soap. Mrs. Chen is a thorough teacher. Thorough's one word for it, Caleb said, but his eyes crinkled with amusement. Mrs. Chen, you working her too hard. No such thing as too hard when there's this much work to be done, Mrs. Chen retorted, but there was affection in her voice. Girl's got grit, though. I'll give her that. Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her skirts, and found Caleb watching her with that same intent focus he'd shown the night before. How was your day? She asked, surprising herself with the question. It was such a domestic thing to ask, as if they were already married, as if this were already her home. Long, Caleb admitted. Found a break in the north fence. Had to mend it before the cattle wandered. Lost half a day to it. He glanced at the setting sun. Mrs. Chen, will you be staying for supper? Can't. Got my own family to feed. Mrs. Chen stood, wiping her hands on her apron. But I've left stew in the pot and that bread should be ready to come out soon. Eleanor knows what to do." She fixed Eleanor with a stern look. "Remember what I showed you about the oven temperature? And Caleb, you keep things proper, you hear?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said obediently. After Mrs. Chen departed in her small wagon, Eleanor found herself alone with Caleb in the gathering dusk. The awkwardness of their situation descended like a physical presence. This strange arrangement they'd made, these 2 weeks of trial, the impossible decision looming at the end. "I should check that bread," Eleanor said, needing something to do with her hands, somewhere to look besides those too perceptive blue eyes. She fled to the kitchen, where the bread had risen beautifully in its pans. Mrs. Chen had shown her how to test the oven temperature, a skill involving her hand and timing that seemed more art than science, and somehow Eleanor managed to slide the pans in without burning herself. The house filled with the yeasty, warm smell of baking bread, and despite her exhaustion, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Pride, she realized. Simple pride in work done with her own hands. Caleb came in as she was checking the stew, adding a bit more water like Mrs. Chen had instructed. He moved to the sink and began pumping water to wash, the muscles in his forearms flexing with the motion. Eleanor found herself watching him, this stranger who'd offered her such an impossible choice, trying to reconcile her fear with the reality of his solid, steady presence. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Caleb turned, water dripping from his hands. "For what?" "For not treating me like an obligation, for letting Mrs. Chen work me like a regular employee instead of some fragile thing that needs coddling." Eleanor's hands tightened on the wooden spoon. "My whole life, people have made decisions for me, about me, without me. My stepfather, the man he wanted me to marry. They never asked what I wanted. They just assumed they knew best." She met his eyes across the kitchen. "You're giving me a choice. That's not nothing." Caleb dried his hands on a towel, his expression thoughtful. "My mama used to say that a person without choices isn't really living. They're just surviving. I figure if we're going to build something here, it needs to be built on choices we both make freely." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm not looking for someone I can control, Eleanor. I'm looking for a partner. There's a difference." "I'm beginning to see that," Eleanor said softly. They ate dinner in a more comfortable silence than breakfast had been, the fresh bread still warm from the oven slathered with butter that Mrs. Chen had churned earlier in the week. Eleanor's every muscle ached. Her hands were blistered and raw, and she was more tired than she'd ever been in her life, but she'd also never felt more accomplished. After the dishes were washed, a task they tackled together, Caleb washing while Eleanor dried and put away, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of what would be her room for the next 2 weeks. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the darkening prairie. Someone, probably Mrs. Chen, had laid out a nightgown and a bar of soap, small kindnesses that made Eleanor's throat tight. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice came from the hallway. She turned to find him standing there, maintaining a respectful distance, his hat in his hands. "Yes?" "I know today was hard. Mrs. Chen doesn't believe in easing someone into work. She throws them in head first. But you did well. Really well." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise but determined to deliver it anyway. "If you want to reconsider the whole arrangement, I understand. I can take you to town tomorrow, get you set up at the boarding house until you figure out where you want to go." Eleanor looked at this man who'd given her food and shelter and the most precious thing of all, a choice about her own future. She thought about the day's labor, about bread rising and floors scrubbed clean, about Mrs. Chen's gruff approval and the satisfaction of work well done. She thought about her stepfather's mansion with its army of servants and its gilded cage of propriety. "I don't want to reconsider," she said firmly. "I want to stay. I want to see what the next 2 weeks bring." Something that might have been relief crossed Caleb's face. "All right then, sleep well, Eleanor. Tomorrow brings more of the same." "Good," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. As she lay in the narrow bed that night, her body aching in 1,000 places, Eleanor stared up at the ceiling and tried to imagine what her stepfather would think if he could see her now, his carefully cultivated stepdaughter, with her blistered hands and dirt-stained dress, sleeping in a ranch house in the middle of Wyoming territory. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made her smile. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of relentless work and surprising satisfaction. Eleanor learned to pump water without stopping to rest every few strokes. She learned to knead bread until her arms didn't scream in protest. She learned to scrub floors and beat rugs and wash windows until they gleamed. She learned which chickens were reliable layers and which were troublemakers, learned to gather eggs without getting pecked, learned to scatter feed in a way that didn't cause a riot. Mrs. Chen was a demanding teacher, but a fair one, showing Eleanor everything from how to use the wood stove efficiently to how to make soap from lye and fat. She taught Eleanor to can the last vegetables from the garden, preparing for the long winter ahead, and how to mend clothes with tiny invisible stitches that would hold under hard use. "You're learning fat, Mrs. Chen admitted one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing a meal for the handful of ranch hands Caleb employed. Faster than I expected, truth be told. Eleanor, who was rolling out pie dough with hands that had developed their first calluses, allowed herself a small smile. "I'm motivated." "That you are." Mrs. Chen's expression grew serious. "You really thinking about staying? About marrying him?" Eleanor's hand stilled on the rolling pin. It was a question she'd been asking herself every night as she fell into bed, exhausted and aching. "I don't know," she admitted. "I barely know him. How can I make a decision like that about someone I barely know?" "You know more than you think," Mrs. Chen said. "You know he's honest. You know he's a hard worker. You know he keeps his word. You know he treats his animals with care and his employees with respect." She paused. "You know he looks at you like you're something precious when he thinks you're not watching." Eleanor's head snapped up. "He what?" Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look. "Girl, I may be old, but I'm not blind. That man watches you the way a thirsty man watches water. He's just being respectful about it because he gave you his word." She returned to seasoning the meat she was preparing. "Question is, how do you look at him?" Eleanor didn't have an answer to that. Or rather, she had too many answers, all of them contradictory. She was grateful to Caleb, yes. She respected him, certainly. She felt safe in his presence in a way she'd never felt safe before. But was that enough to build a marriage on? That evening, Caleb asked if she'd like to see more of the ranch. They walked together through the golden autumn twilight, Caleb pointing out landmarks and boundaries, explaining the work and rhythms of ranch life. He spoke about his cattle with obvious pride, about his plans for the spring, about the challenges of making a living from the unforgiving land. "You really love it here," Eleanor observed, watching the way his face came alive when he talked about the ranch. "It's home," Caleb said simply. "Only home I've ever known. My grandfather built this place from nothing, and my father expanded it. James and I grew up here, learning the land, learning the work." His voice grew quieter. "After he died, everyone expected me to sell. Said it was too much for one man. But I couldn't. This place is all I have left of my family." "That's why you need help," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Not just because the work is hard, but because you're trying to preserve something." "Maybe," Caleb admitted. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "But it's more than that, too. A ranch isn't just land and cattle. It's supposed to be a home, a place where people build lives together. And I've been maintaining it, keeping it running, but it hasn't been a home in 3 years. It's just been a place where I work until I'm too tired to think." Eleanor's heart twisted at the loneliness in his voice. "And you think a wife would change that?" "I think a partner would," Caleb corrected gently. "Someone to share the work and the worry, someone to talk to over supper instead of eating alone in silence, someone to build something with instead of just trying to hold on to what's left." He met her eyes, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it rarely was. "I know it's not romantic. I know I'm not offering you courtship or poetry or any of the things a woman usually wants, but I'm offering you something real, something you can build a life on." "What if I can't do it?" Eleanor whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough or skilled enough or—" "You walked across Wyoming territory alone," Caleb interrupted. "You've worked harder in the past week than most society ladies work in a year. You've tackled every task Mrs. Chen's given you without complaint." His voice softened. Eleanor, you're stronger than you know. The question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether you want to. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. I don't know what I want. All I know is what I don't want. To go back to St. Louis, to be controlled and owned and treated like property. But wanting to escape something isn't the same as wanting to embrace something else. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. And I won't pressure you. You've got a week left before you need to decide. That's time enough to figure out what you want. He pulled off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, a gesture so instinctively gentle it made her breath catch. Come on, it's getting cold. Let's head back. They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, the awkwardness of those first days slowly fading into something easier. Eleanor found herself noticing things about Caleb she hadn't seen before. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the gentleness of his hands when he opened the gate for her, the patience in his voice when he explained something she didn't understand. Mrs. Chen had left supper warming on the stove, along with a note reminding Eleanor to bank the fire before bed. They ate together, talking about the day's work, and Eleanor realized with a start that this felt normal, natural, like something they'd been doing for years instead of days. After dinner, as Eleanor washed dishes and Caleb dried, he said quietly, My brother used to say that home isn't a place. It's a feeling. I'd forgotten that until you got here. Eleanor's hand stilled in the soapy water. What do you mean? I mean this house feels alive again, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. There's bread in this kitchen and flowers on the table and the smell of someone else's presence in the air. It feels like a home instead of just a building. He set down the plate he'd been drying. I didn't realize how much I missed that until it came back. Eleanor turned to face him, her wet hands dripping on the floor. Caleb, I'm not trying to influence your decision, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know what your presence here has meant. Regardless of what you decide at the end of the 2 weeks, I'm grateful you came here. You reminded me what I've been missing. Before Eleanor could respond, he'd left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. She stood alone, her hands trembling, her heart racing with something she couldn't quite name. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Eleanor finally let herself think about the question Mrs. Chen had asked. How did she look at Caleb Ward? She thought about his quiet strength, his steady presence, the way he never raised his voice or made demands. She thought about the way he'd carried her when she nearly collapsed, the way he'd fed her without question, the way he'd offered her protection without expecting anything in return. She thought about his eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that saw her not as a commodity or an obligation, but as a person, a partner, an equal. And she realized, with a mixture of terror and wonder, that somewhere between scrubbing floors and baking bread, between learning to pump water and tend chickens, she'd stopped seeing Caleb Ward as a stranger offering a business arrangement. She'd started seeing him as a man, lonely and wounded and trying so hard to build something meaningful from the ruins of his grief. She'd started seeing him as someone she could maybe, possibly, build a life with. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first honest truth she'd allowed herself in years. The morning of Eleanor's 10th day at Cedar Bluff Ranch dawned gray and heavy, the sky pressing down like a wool blanket soaked in water. She woke to an unfamiliar sound, a low moaning wind that rattled the window panes and sent an instinctive shiver of unease down her spine. When she looked out the window, the mountains had disappeared entirely, swallowed by clouds so thick and dark they looked almost solid. Mrs. Chen arrived earlier than usual, her face tight with worry. Storm's coming, she announced, setting down a basket packed with extra supplies. Bad one by the look of those clouds. I need to get home before it hits, but I'm leaving you enough food for several days. Caleb will need to bring the cattle closer to the ranch, and you'll need to help prepare. Eleanor, who had never experienced anything more dramatic than a spring thunderstorm in St. Louis, felt a flutter of anxiety. How bad will it be? Bad enough, Mrs. Chen said grimly. This time of year we get blizzards that can bury a man standing upright. Temperature drops so fast your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. You don't go outside in weather like this unless you've got a rope tied around your waist connecting you to the house, because you can get lost 10 feet from your own door and freeze to death before you find your way back. The words painted a terrifying picture. Eleanor had known Wyoming was harsh. She'd felt it in the biting wind and seen it in the endless, unforgiving landscape. But this was something beyond her experience, beyond anything her sheltered city life had prepared her for. Caleb came in from the barn, his face set in grim lines. "Mrs. Chen, you need to leave now. The temperature's already dropping, and I can smell snow on the wind." I know! Mrs. Chen grabbed Eleanor by the shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, girl. You do exactly what Caleb tells you. Don't try to be brave or prove anything. In weather like this, pride kills. Understand?" Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. After Mrs. Chen's wagon disappeared down the road at a pace that spoke to her urgency, Caleb turned to Eleanor. "I need to ride out and bring the herd closer to the ranch. The near pasture has some shelter from the wind, and I can keep an eye on them from here, but I need you to prepare the house." "Tell me what to do," Eleanor said, pushing down her fear. Caleb's instructions came rapid fire. "Fill every pot and bucket with water from the pump, because the pump might freeze. Bring in extra firewood and stack it near the stove and fireplace. Check that all the windows are sealed tight. Make sure there's food prepared that can be eaten cold if necessary, because they might not be able to cook if the chimney got blocked with snow. Move the chickens from their outside coop into the barn where they'd have better protection." Eleanor worked with desperate efficiency, her hands moving even as her mind tried to process the danger they were facing. She'd hauled more water in the past week than she'd probably used in her entire life in St. Louis, but now she pumped until her arms screamed and every container in the house was full. She made trip after trip to the woodpile, carrying armloads of split logs until the space beside the fireplace was stacked high. She sealed windows with rags stuffed into cracks, following patterns she'd seen Mrs. Chen use. The chickens proved more challenging. The hens, sensing the coming storm, were agitated and uncooperative. Eleanor had never caught a chicken before, and her first several attempts ended with her sprawled in the dirt while the birds scattered, squawking indignantly. But desperation made her determined, and eventually she managed to catch them one by one, tucking them under her arm and running them to the barn where she deposited them in a hastily prepared pen. She was chasing the last recalcitrant hen when the first snowflakes began to fall. They were nothing like the delicate flakes Eleanor remembered from St. Louis winters. These were hard and sharp, driven by wind that had turned vicious, stinging her exposed skin like tiny needles. Within minutes, the world had turned white, visibility dropping to mere feet. Eleanor caught the hen more by luck than skill, clutching it to her chest as she stumbled toward the barn, already disoriented by the swirling whiteness. She made it inside and secured the hen with the others, then stood in the barn doorway, staring out at what had become an impenetrable wall of white. Fear seized her heart. Caleb was still out there, somewhere in that impossible storm, trying to bring the cattle in alone. Eleanor had no idea how long she stood there, shivering in the barn doorway, before she saw shapes emerging from the white chaos. Cattle first, dozens of them, their dark forms moving like shadows through the snow. And behind them, mounted on his horse, Caleb appeared like a ghost rider, his face raw and red from the wind, ice already forming in his beard. He drove the cattle into the near pasture and closed the gate, then rode straight to the barn. Eleanor rushed forward to help as he dismounted, his movements stiff and clumsy with cold. "Get inside!" he shouted over the wind, which had risen to a howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Now!" They ran for the house, Caleb's hand gripping Eleanor's arm to keep them together in the blinding snow. Even the short distance from barn to house was terrifying. Eleanor lost all sense of direction, unable to see anything but white, trusting only Caleb's sure grip to guide her. When they finally stumbled through the door, the relief was so intense Eleanor's knees buckled. Caleb caught her, his hands like ice through her dress. "I'm fine," she gasped. "I'm fine. But you're frozen." And he was. His face was white except for patches of angry red where the wind had flayed the skin. His hands, when she took them in hers, were so cold they felt like marble. Ice clung to his eyebrows and beard, and his whole body shook with violent shivers. "Fireplace," Eleanor said, pulling him toward the warmth. "Sit down. Now." For once, Caleb didn't argue. He sank into the chair nearest the fire while Eleanor ran for blankets, her heart hammering with fear she tried not to show. She'd heard stories about frostbite, about people losing fingers and toes to cold like this. She wrapped him in every blanket she could find, then knelt before him and began working on his boots, trying to ease them off his frozen feet. Eleanor, you don't have to. Hush, she said firmly. Mrs. Chen told me to do what you said. Well, now I'm telling you to sit still and let me help you. His boots finally came off, revealing feet that were dangerously pale. Eleanor rubbed them gently, trying to restore circulation, terrified she might be doing it wrong. Caleb endured her ministrations in silence, his teeth chattering too hard for speech. I'll make coffee, Eleanor said, forcing herself to sound calm. Hot and strong. And soup. There's soup I can heat. She worked with shaking hands, putting the coffee on to boil, ladling soup from the pot Mrs. Chen had left into a smaller pan to heat faster. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls. Snow piled against the glass, blocking out what little light remained. When the coffee was ready, Eleanor brought it to Caleb, wrapping his hands around the cup. Some of the warmth seemed to return to his face as he drank, the violent shivering gradually subsiding to occasional tremors. Thank you, he said finally, his voice rough, for getting everything prepared, for taking care of the chickens, for... He gestured vaguely at the blankets cocooning him, the coffee, her obvious concern. You're welcome, Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from him. Is it always like this? Sometimes worse, Caleb admitted. We're lucky I got the cattle in when I did. Another hour and I might not have found my way back. The casual way he said it, as if he might have died out there in the white chaos, made Eleanor's stomach clench. How long will the storm last? Could be a day, could be 3. Caleb took another sip of coffee. We're well stocked, and we've got each other for company. We'll be fine. The words, we've got each other, hung in the air between them, suddenly weighted with meaning. They were alone now, truly alone in a way they hadn't been with Mrs. Chen coming and going, just the two of them in this small house, with a blizzard raging outside and days stretching ahead. Eleanor stood abruptly, needing to do something with her hands. You should eat. Get some food in you to help warm up from the inside. She brought him a bowl of soup and more bread, watching his color slowly return to his face. The shivers had stopped now, though he remained wrapped in blankets like some kind of Viking chieftain. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, Eleanor found herself studying him with new eyes. This man had risked his life to save his cattle, had pushed through a blizzard to get back to the ranch. To get back to her, a small voice in her head whispered. This man who'd given her shelter and safety and asked for nothing in return except the possibility of partnership. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked, catching her staring. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm thinking that Mrs. Chen was right. You're either very brave or very foolish, going out in weather like that alone. Probably a bit of both, Caleb said with a slight smile. But those cattle are my livelihood. Losing them would mean losing the ranch. And the ranch means everything to you. It did, Caleb said quietly. Before you came, it was all I had. Now, he trailed off, looking away. Now, Eleanor prompted, her heart beating faster, but Caleb just shook his head. Now I'm realizing there might be more to life than just surviving from one season to the next. Night fell early, the storm blocking what little daylight managed to penetrate the clouds. Eleanor lit lamps and kept the fire burning high, acutely aware of Caleb's presence in the small space. They ate dinner together, the wind howling outside like a pack of wolves, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the storm in a strange way. Here, isolated from the world, the artificial boundaries they'd maintained seemed to dissolve. There was no Mrs. Chen to chaperone, no separate spheres of work to keep them apart. There was just the two of them, forced into a proximity that felt both dangerous and oddly right. Tell me about St. Louis, Caleb said as they cleaned up after dinner. What was your life like there? Eleanor had been avoiding thinking about her past, but something in the storm's isolation made it feel safe to share. It was suffocating, she said honestly. My mother died when I was 17. She was the buffer between me and my stepfather. He'd always been stern, but with her gone, he became controlling. Everything I did, everywhere I went, everyone I spoke to had to be approved. He said it was for my own good, that he was protecting me. But he wasn't, Caleb said, and it wasn't a question. No, he was protecting his investment. I didn't understand that until he announced my engagement to Marcus Thornton. Eleanor's hands tightened on the dish she was drying. Marcus was 53 years old, recently widowed, with a fortune made in railroads. My stepfather had been courting his business favor for years. Marrying me to Marcus would seal their partnership. And what did Marcus want with a young bride? An ornament, Eleanor said bitterly. Someone young and pretty to show off at parties, to make him look vital and virile to his business associates. Someone who would give him children to inherit his empire. She set down the dish with more force than necessary. The first time I met him, he looked at me the way you'd look at a horse you were considering purchasing, checking my teeth, assessing my health, calculating my value. Caleb's jaw tightened. So you ran? So I ran, Eleanor confirmed. I stole money from my stepfather's desk, money that was rightfully my mother's, held in trust that he'd been managing for me. I bought a train ticket west with no destination in mind except away. I thought maybe I could find work as a teacher or a governess, somewhere far enough that his reach wouldn't extend. You could have, Caleb said. You're clearly educated. Why not try that instead of staying at a ranch in the middle of nowhere with a stranger? Eleanor took her time answering. Because teachers and governesses still have to provide references. They still have to give their real names and their histories. My stepfather would have found me eventually. He has connections, resources, determination, but a rancher's wife in Wyoming territory? That's a new identity. That's legal protection. She met his eyes. That's freedom in a way nothing else could be. Is that the only reason you're considering staying? Caleb asked quietly. Just for the protection of a new name? Eleanor's breath caught. It was the question that had been hovering between them for days, unspoken but always present. She thought about her answer carefully, knowing it mattered. It was at first, she admitted. But these past 10 days have taught me something. I've worked harder here than I ever worked in my life, and I've been happier. I felt useful in a way I never did managing servants and planning tea parties. I've felt, she searched for the right word, real. Like I matter, not because of who my family was or how I look or how much money I might bring to a marriage, but because of what I can do with my own two hands. You do matter, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. More than you know. Outside, the wind screamed louder, as if objecting to their conversation. Snow pelted against the windows with a sound like thrown gravel. The storm was worsening, and Eleanor felt a spike of real fear. What if the house couldn't withstand this? What if the cold got inside despite their preparations? As if reading her thoughts, Caleb said, House has stood through worse than this. My grandfather built it to last. He paused, then added, But it's going to be a long, cold night. We should probably sleep near the fire. It's the warmest place in the house. Eleanor understood what he was suggesting, that they would spend the night in the main room together, propriety abandoned in favor of survival. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead she felt only a strange sense of relief. The last thing she wanted was to be alone in that small bedroom while the storm raged. They prepared makeshift beds near the fireplace, Caleb insisting Eleanor take the better position closer to the fire while he bedded down on the floor nearby. Eleanor changed into her nightgown in the bedroom, wrapping herself in a shawl for modesty, then returned to find Caleb had banked the fire to burn steady through the night and was lying on his pallet, staring up at the ceiling. Can't sleep? Eleanor asked, settling onto her own makeshift bed. Thinking too much, Caleb admitted. About what? He was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly he said, About James. About the last time we had a storm like this. He was still alive then, and we spent 3 days trapped in here playing cards and arguing about everything under the sun. He had opinions about everything. Politics, cattle breeding, the best way to break a horse. Half his opinions were wrong, but he'd defend them like they were gospel truth. Caleb's voice was thick with memory. I'd give anything to argue with him one more time. Eleanor's heart ached for him. What was he like? Full of life, Caleb said immediately. Everything I'm not. He could walk into a room and everyone would gravitate toward him like flowers toward the sun. He made friends easily, laughed easily, loved easily. When he died, it felt like all the light went out of the world. That's why Sarah left, Eleanor said, understanding suddenly. Not because you were too dangerous, but because you reminded her too much of what you'd lost. Maybe, Caleb said, or maybe she was just being practical, like Mrs. Chen said. Either way, it taught me something important. What's that? That you can't rely on other people to make your life meaningful. You have to build meaning yourself, from your own hands and your own choices. He rolled onto his side, facing her across the small distance between their beds. In the firelight, his eyes were impossibly blue. That's what I've been trying to do here. Build something that matters. But I was doing it alone, and I'm starting to think that's not how it's meant to be done. No, Eleanor agreed softly. I don't think it is. They fell silent, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. Eleanor found herself thinking about partnership, about what it really meant to build a life with someone. Not the fairy tale romance of novels where passionate declarations led to guaranteed happiness, but something deeper, two people choosing each other deliberately, working together toward common goals, finding meaning in shared labor and shared dreams. Caleb, she said into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you for giving me time, for not pressuring me, for letting me figure things out at my own pace. That's what partners do, Caleb said. They give each other space to grow. Eleanor drifted toward sleep with those words echoing in her mind, warm and safe by the fire, listening to Caleb's steady breathing and the storm's fury outside. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She woke to the sound of something between a bellow and a scream, a sound of animal terror that cut through the storm's howl and sent her heart into her throat. Caleb was already on his feet, pulling on his boots with rapid efficiency. What is that? Eleanor asked, scrambling up. Sounds like a calf in distress, Caleb said grimly. Must have gotten separated from the herd before I brought them in. You can't go out in that, Eleanor protested, looking toward the windows where snow had drifted halfway up the glass. You'll freeze. If I don't, that calf will die. Caleb was already pulling on his heaviest coat, wrapping a scarf around his face. I'll be quick. Stay inside. Keep the fire going. If I'm not back in half an hour, don't come looking for me. Wait until the storm breaks. Caleb, please. But he was already at the door, and then he was gone, swallowed by the white chaos beyond. Eleanor stood frozen for a heartbeat, then ran to the window, trying to see through the snow-covered glass. She could make out nothing but white. No barn, no corrals, no Caleb. Just an endless, swirling void. 20 minutes passed like hours. Eleanor paced between the fire and the window, her imagination conjuring 1,000 terrible scenarios. Caleb lost in the storm, disoriented, freezing. Caleb buried under a snowdrift. Caleb fallen, injured, unable to make it back. When 25 minutes had passed, Eleanor made a decision that was probably foolish but felt absolutely necessary. She began pulling on every warm thing she owned, layering dress over nightgown, wrapping herself in shawls and blankets. If Caleb wasn't back in 5 more minutes, she would go after him, storm be damned. She was reaching for the door handle when it burst open, admitting a blast of wind and snow and Caleb carrying something in his arms. He stumbled inside and Eleanor slammed the door behind him, fighting the wind to get it closed. Caleb was covered head to toe in snow and ice, but in his arms, wrapped in his coat, was a small calf, a tiny thing that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its eyes wide with terror, its body shaking. It was caught in a drift, Caleb gasped, his words barely intelligible through his frozen scarf. Mother must have panicked during the roundup and left it behind. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Bring it to the fire, now. They laid the calf on blankets near the hearth, and Eleanor began rubbing it down with towels while Caleb shed his frozen outer layers. The calf was in bad shape. Its breathing was shallow, its temperature dangerously low. Eleanor had no idea how to save a dying calf, but she knew about warming frozen things from when Caleb had come in from the storm the first time. What do we do? She asked, looking up at Caleb with desperate eyes. Keep it warm. Get some warm milk into it if we can. Caleb was already moving despite his own frozen state, heading for the kitchen. If we can raise its core temperature and get some food in it, it has a chance. They worked together with desperate efficiency. Eleanor continued rubbing the calf, talking to it in soothing tones while Caleb heated milk from their stores to body temperature. When he brought it back, they had to pry the calf's mouth open and pour it in carefully, a few drops at a time, terrified it would choke. Hours passed in a blur of desperate care. The calf's breathing would strengthen, then weaken. Its eyes would focus, then glaze over. Eleanor found herself praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, bargaining for this small life with a fervor that surprised her. "Come on," she whispered to the calf, her hands gentle on its small head. "Come on, little one. Fight." Dawn was breaking, or what passed for dawn in the ongoing storm, when the calf finally seemed to turn a corner. Its breathing steadied, its eyes cleared. It even managed a weak, wobbling attempt to stand before collapsing back onto the blankets. "It's going to make it," Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. He was sitting on the floor beside Eleanor, both of them disheveled and exhausted, covered in various fluids from their patient. "You did it. We did it," Eleanor corrected. She looked at the man beside her, at this rancher who'd risked his life in a blizzard for a single calf, and something inside her shifted into place with an almost audible click. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." He turned to face her, his blue eyes questioning. "I don't need the rest of the 2 weeks," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I've made my decision." Caleb went very still. And I want to stay. I want to marry you. I want to be your partner in this ranch, in this life." Eleanor reached out and took his hand, his rough, work-worn, honest hand. "Not because I'm desperate or because I need protection, although those things are true, but because I've seen who you are. I've seen your kindness and your strength and the way you care for every living thing under your care. I've seen the way you treat me like an equal, like someone whose opinion matters. And I've realized that I want to build a life with you." For a long moment, Caleb didn't speak. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, a real smile, warm and genuine and transforming his usually serious features. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then as soon as this storm breaks, we'll ride to town and make it legal. I want you to be Eleanor Ward, and I want everyone to know it." They sat together on the floor, watching the calf sleep, while outside the storm continued its rage. But inside, by the fire, Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. She'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just safety or security, but a place where she belonged. A partner who saw her truly. A chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. The calf stirred and made a small sound, and Eleanor found herself laughing, exhausted, relieved, almost giddy with the enormity of her decision and the rightness of it. "What's funny?" Caleb asked, his own lips twitching. "I was just thinking that I came here looking for work, and I'm leaving with a husband and apparently a pet calf." Eleanor shook her head. "My stepfather would be appalled." "Good," Caleb said firmly. "Let him be appalled from 1,000 miles away while you live your life the way you choose." They stayed by the fire as the storm raged on, taking turns watching over the calf, talking quietly about their future. Caleb told her about his plans for the ranch, asking her opinions, treating her ideas as valuable rather than dismissing them as flights of fancy. Eleanor told him about her dreams of teaching, and Caleb immediately began brainstorming ways they could start a small school for ranch children in the area. "There's space in one of the outbuildings," he said eagerly. "We could convert it, make it warm and tight. You could teach in winter when there's less outdoor work." The fact that he'd taken her dream seriously, that he'd immediately begun planning ways to make it reality, made Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. This was what partnership meant, not one person's dreams subordinated to another's, but both sets of dreams woven together into something richer. The storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the wind dying as suddenly as it had risen, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow had drifted so high against the house that they had to shovel their way out the door. The sky was clear and impossibly blue, the sun reflecting off the white landscape with blinding intensity. The calf, which Eleanor had started calling Miracle, was on its feet and bleeding for food. The cattle in the near pasture had survived, huddled together for warmth. The chickens in the barn were annoyed but alive. Against all odds, Cedar Bluff Ranch had made it through intact. Mrs. Chen arrived that afternoon, her wagon struggling through the drifts, her face creased with worry that transformed to shock when she saw Eleanor and Caleb working together to dig out the barn, easy and comfortable with each other in a way they hadn't been before the storm. "Well," she said, climbing down from her wagon and assessing them both with those sharp eyes, "something's changed." "We're getting married," Eleanor said simply, "as soon as we can get to town." Mrs. Chen's face split into a smile so wide it seemed to transform her entire being. "About time. I was starting to think you both needed your heads examined." She pulled Eleanor into a fierce hug. "Welcome to the family, girl." The journey to town took 2 days. The roads were nearly impassable with snow, and they had to stop frequently to dig out the wagon. Caleb had wanted to wait until conditions improved, but Eleanor had been adamant. She'd made her choice, and she wanted it made real before doubt could creep in or before fate could intervene. The town of Cedar Springs was small and weathered, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single main street. Caleb drove straight to the courthouse, where a justice of the peace with kind eyes and a spectacular mustache listened to their request. "You got a license?" he asked. "Not yet," Caleb admitted. "We'll do whatever needs doing. Just tell us what's required." The process took most of the afternoon, papers to fill out, witnesses to round up from the general store, a brief waiting period that the justice agreed to waive given the circumstances and the difficulty of the journey. Eleanor signed her name as Eleanor Graves for the last time, feeling a strange mix of grief and relief as she watched the ink dry. That girl from St. Louis was gone forever. In her place stood Eleanor Ward, rancher's wife, partner in a new life. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. No flowers, no music, no guests beyond the witnesses legally required. Just Caleb and Eleanor standing before the justice, promising to honor and cherish each other, to be partners in all things, to face whatever came together. When Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, his mother's ring, a simple gold band that fit perfectly, Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, not tears of doubt or regret, but tears of relief. She'd done it. She'd escaped her old life and claimed a new one entirely on her own terms. "You may kiss your bride," the justice said with a smile. Caleb looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes even now, still asking permission, still respecting her choice. Eleanor answered by rising on her toes and kissing him, a gentle, sweet kiss that tasted like promises and possibilities and new beginnings. They emerged from the courthouse into the late afternoon sun as husband and wife. Caleb helped Eleanor into the wagon with a formality that made her smile, and they began the long journey back to Cedar Bluff Ranch. Back home. "No regrets?" Caleb asked as they drove through the snow-covered landscape, the sun painting everything gold and pink. Eleanor looked at her new husband, at his strong profile, at the gentle hands holding the reins, at the life stretching before them full of challenges and possibilities. "Not a single one," she said honestly, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The reality of being married settled over Eleanor in the days following the ceremony like snow accumulating on a roof, gradual, substantial, and transforming everything beneath it. She was Eleanor Ward now, a name that still felt strange on her tongue, a name that carried weight and permanence and possibility. The ring on her finger caught the light as she worked, a constant reminder that she'd chosen this life, this man, this future, built on honesty rather than obligation. Mrs. Chen had greeted their news with practical efficiency, immediately diving into plans to properly set up the main bedroom for the newlyweds. Eleanor had protested that it wasn't necessary, that they could continue as they'd been, but Mrs. Chen had fixed her with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. "You're married now," she'd said firmly. "Married people share a room. That's how it works. Unless—" She'd turned that penetrating gaze on Caleb. "Unless there's a reason they shouldn't?" "No reason," Caleb had said quietly, his eyes finding Eleanor's. "Unless Eleanor wants otherwise." And there it was again, that constant offering of choice, that refusal to assume or demand. Eleanor had felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that might have been the beginning of love, or might simply have been profound gratitude for being seen as a person rather than a possession. "The main bedroom is fine," she'd said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. So Mrs. Chen had spent a day cleaning and organizing, bringing in fresh linens that smelled of lavender, placing wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, creating a space that felt less like Caleb's solitary domain and more like a room meant for two. Eleanor moved her few possessions from the spare room, feeling both excitement and trepidation about this next step in their arrangement. That first night as a married couple, they'd approached the bedroom with the awkwardness of two strangers learning an unfamiliar dance. Caleb had given Eleanor space to change in private, waiting in the main room until she called that she was ready. When he entered, she was already under the covers, her hair braided for sleep, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. He'd changed into sleep clothes in the corner with his back to her, a gesture of modesty that touched her more than grand romantic declarations might have. When he slid under the covers on his side of the bed, he maintained a careful distance, his body a warm presence but not an imposing one. "Eleanor," he'd said into the darkness, his voice soft. "I meant what I said before. Nothing happens here that you don't want. This is your space too. Your choice too." She'd reached across the space between them and found his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I know," she'd whispered, "and I'm grateful for that. But Caleb, I'm not made of glass. I won't break." "I know you won't," he'd said, squeezing her hand gently. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. I just want you to know that I see this marriage as a partnership first. Everything else, we'll figure it out together in our own time." They'd fallen asleep like that, hands joined across the space between them, and Eleanor had woken in the morning to find that sometime during the night they'd gravitated toward each other, her back pressed against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. The intimacy of it had startled her, but not unpleasantly. It felt natural, right? Like puzzle pieces settling into place. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost magical in its ordinariness. Eleanor woke each morning to Caleb's quiet movements as he dressed for the day's work, the smell of coffee brewing, the soft sounds of the ranch coming to life. She learned to make breakfast that satisfied a working man's appetite. Thick slices of bacon, eggs fried in butter, biscuits that grew lighter and fluffier with each attempt. Mrs. Chen praised her progress grudgingly, which Eleanor had learned was the housekeeper's version of effusive compliments. The days were filled with work that never seemed to end, but somehow never felt burdensome. Eleanor took over management of the kitchen garden completely, planning what they'd plant in spring, learning about crop rotation and companion planting from Mrs. Chen's vast store of knowledge. She learned to preserve and pickle, to make soap and candles, to mend clothes so expertly that the repairs were nearly invisible. Her hands, once soft and decorative, became capable and strong, marked with small scars and calluses that she wore with quiet pride. But it was the evenings Eleanor came to treasure most. After the day's work was done, after dinner was eaten and dishes washed, she and Caleb would sit together in the main room. Sometimes they'd work on separate tasks, Eleanor with her mending or knitting, Caleb with his account books or harness repairs. But increasingly, they'd simply talk, sharing stories of their days, discussing plans for the ranch, debating everything from politics to the best way to train a horse. Caleb was, Eleanor discovered, an educated man despite his rough exterior. His mother had been a school teacher before marrying his father, and she'd insisted both her sons learn to read and think critically. He had opinions about everything and could defend them with logic and passion, but he also listened when Eleanor challenged him, treating her thoughts as worthy of serious consideration. "You should have been a lawyer," Eleanor teased one night after a particularly spirited debate about land management. "You argue like one. And you should have been a professor," Caleb countered with a smile. "The way you can take apart an argument and rebuild it stronger, that's a rare gift." These conversations filled something in Eleanor she hadn't realized was empty. In St. Louis, she'd been expected to look pretty and agree with whatever men said, to never express an opinion stronger than a preference for tea over coffee. Here, with Caleb, she could be fully herself, sharp and questioning and passionately engaged with ideas. It was intoxicating. One evening, about 6 weeks into their marriage, Eleanor was reading aloud from a book of poetry while Caleb worked on repairing a bridle. She finished a particularly beautiful sonnet and looked up to find him watching her instead of his work, an expression on his face she couldn't quite decipher. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing. I like listening to you read, like watching you get excited about ideas." He set down the bridle. "You light up when you're talking about things you care about. Did you know that?" Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I used to drive my stepfather crazy with it. He said educated women were unnatural, that I should focus on accomplishments that would make me a suitable wife." "He was an idiot," Caleb said bluntly. "Your mind is one of the best things about you. Any man who'd want you to diminish it doesn't deserve you." The words, said so simply and sincerely, made Eleanor's throat tight. She set down the book and crossed to where Caleb sat, surprising them both by settling beside him on the bench. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me, for valuing all of me, not just the convenient parts." Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "Eleanor, there isn't a part of you that isn't valuable. You must know that by now." She did know it, she realized. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and saving calves, between learning to bake bread and debating philosophy, she'd stopped seeing herself through her stepfather's diminishing lens. She'd started seeing herself as Caleb saw her, as someone capable and strong and worthy of respect. Eleanor leaned into his touch, and when his thumb brushed across her lower lip, she felt heat flare low in her belly. They'd been careful with each other these past weeks, affectionate but restrained, building friendship and partnership before anything more intense. But now, in the lamplight of their home, with winter settling deep outside and warmth surrounding them inside, Eleanor felt something shift. "Caleb," she whispered. He understood without her having to say more. His hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer, and when their lips met, it was nothing like the chaste kiss they'd shared at their wedding. This was deeper, hungrier, full of weeks of growing attraction and carefully maintained distance finally breaking free. Eleanor's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Caleb made a low sound in his throat that sent shivers down her spine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Eleanor, I need you to be sure. I need to know this is what you want, not what you think I expect." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and she was. This wasn't obligation or duty or resignation. This was desire, pure and simple and entirely her own. "I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. They were both nervous, Caleb afraid of hurting her, Eleanor uncertain but willing. Both of them fumbling through intimacy with honest vulnerability rather than practiced seduction. There was laughter when elbows got in the way, gentle reassurances when uncertainty crept in, and through it all, a growing sense of rightness that transcended the physical act itself. Afterward, lying in their bed with Caleb's arms around her and moonlight streaming through the window, Eleanor felt something profound settle in her chest. This was what marriage was supposed to be, not ownership but partnership, not obligation but choice, not diminishment but expansion. She'd found in Caleb Ward something she hadn't even known to look for. A man who made her more herself rather than less. "I love you," she said into the darkness, the words surprising her with their truth. She hadn't meant to love him. That had never been part of the plan. But somewhere between desperation and partnership, affection had bloomed into something deeper. Caleb's arms tightened around her. "I love you too," he said roughly. "Have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think I was trying to manipulate you or pressure you." "I know you better than that now," Eleanor said, tilting her head back to look at him. "You're the most honest man I've ever known." They fell asleep tangled together, and Eleanor dreamed of spring and new beginnings, and a future that looked nothing like the life she'd fled, but everything like the life she'd hoped for without knowing it existed. Winter deepened, and with it, Eleanor's roots in this new life grew stronger. Word had spread through the surrounding ranches about Caleb Ward's mysterious bride, and neighbors began calling, curious, judgmental, or genuinely welcoming depending on their disposition. Eleanor weathered their scrutiny with grace learned in St. Louis drawing rooms, though now that grace was backed by the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. Some of the women were openly skeptical. Mary Crawford, the wife of the mercantile owner and sister-in-law to Sarah Blackwood, arrived one afternoon with a basket of preserves and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How nice that Caleb found someone," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but nice. "And so quickly, too. You only arrived in autumn, I hear." "That's right," Eleanor said pleasantly, pouring tea with steady hands. "Sometimes you just know when something's right." Mary's gaze swept the kitchen, taking in the cleanliness, the fresh bread cooling on the counter, the herbs drying from the rafters. "You've certainly made yourself at home. Tell me, what did you do back east? You clearly weren't a farm girl." It was a trap, Eleanor recognized, an attempt to expose her as unsuitable, or worse, as someone with a scandalous past. But she'd learned something in her weeks at Cedar Bluff. The truth, or at least a version of it, was often the strongest defense. "I managed a large household in St. Louis," she said truthfully, "but I found that life confining. I wanted to build something with my own hands, to be a partner rather than an ornament. Caleb offered me that opportunity." "How romantic," Mary said with obvious skepticism. "And your family? Surely they had opinions about you running off to marry a rancher." "My mother is dead, and my stepfather and I were not close," Eleanor said, her voice cooling. "I chose my own path, Mrs. Crawford. Not everyone may understand that choice, but it's mine to make." The conversation continued in that vein for another uncomfortable half hour before Mary finally departed, her curiosity unsatisfied and her judgment clear. Eleanor closed the door behind her with relief, leaning against it and closing her eyes. "That was Mary Crawford, I take it?" Caleb's voice came from behind her. Eleanor turned to find him standing in the hallway, covered in dust from the barn. "How did you know?" "Because she's the only person in the territory who could make you look like you'd rather face down a grizzly bear." He crossed to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "What did she say?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Eleanor assured him. "Just the usual probing about my background, my unsuitability for ranch life, my suspicious origins." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you. Some people in this town have long memories and short imaginations. They think everyone should live by their rules." "Let them think what they want," Eleanor said firmly. "I know who I am now. I know what I'm capable of. Their opinions don't change that." The pride in Caleb's eyes made her feel 10 feet tall. "That's my girl," he said, and kissed her soundly. But not all the visits were hostile. Margaret Chen, a distant relative of their housekeeper, came with her husband and 3 children, bringing warmth and genuine welcome. She was a decade older than Eleanor, weathered by hard living but with eyes that sparkled with humor and intelligence. "Don't mind Mary Crawford," she said over coffee while their husbands discussed cattle prices. "She's bitter because Sarah Blackwood has been crying in her preserves ever since you arrived. Turns out Caleb Ward wasn't such a bad prospect after all, now that he's clearly thriving." "Sarah regrets breaking things off?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the spike of possessiveness she felt. "Regrets it deeply," Margaret confirmed. "She thought she was being practical marrying Thomas. And Thomas is nice enough, I suppose, but he's also boring as unsalted porridge and about as exciting. She sees Caleb happy now, sees how he looks at you, and realizes what she gave up." Margaret's expression turned serious. "But don't let that worry you. Caleb never looked at her the way he looks at you. With Sarah, he was trying to do what was expected. With you, he's being himself." The words comforted Eleanor more than they probably should have. She didn't want to be petty or jealous, but the thought of Sarah Blackwood regretting her choice felt like vindication. Caleb had offered that woman his heart, and she'd thrown it back. Eleanor had been given his partnership, and in time his heart had followed. There was a profound difference. As winter wore into early spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a missed cycle, morning nausea, a tenderness in her breast that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Chen confirmed it with a single knowing look. "You're breeding," she announced one morning when Eleanor had to run outside to be sick. "Seen that look 1,000 times. You'll want to tell Caleb today." Eleanor's hand went to her still flat stomach. wonder and terror warring within her. A child. She was going to have a child with Caleb. The enormity of it staggered her. This wasn't part of their practical arrangement. This was real, permanent, a life they'd created together. She told Caleb that evening after dinner, her heart hammering as she led him to sit at the table. "I have news," she began, then found she couldn't say the words. Instead, she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Caleb's face went through a series of expressions so quickly Eleanor could barely track them. Shock, fear, joy, wonder, and finally, a radiant happiness that transformed his entire being. "A baby?" he whispered, as if afraid speaking louder would make it untrue. "We're going to have a baby?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said if they were happy or overwhelmed or both. "In late summer, Mrs. Chen thinks." Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much, Eleanor. I can't believe I never thought I'd have this. A family again, a real family." They held each other as the light faded outside. Two people who'd found in each other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Eleanor thought about the girl who'd stumbled to this ranch months ago, desperate, afraid, running from a future that had been chosen for her. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd chosen her own path and found not just survival, but genuine happiness. The news of the pregnancy spread through the small community with surprising speed. Suddenly, women who'd been coolly polite became warmer, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, sharing stories of their own pregnancies. It was as if the baby legitimized Eleanor's place in a way her marriage hadn't quite managed. She was no longer just an outsider who'd trapped Caleb Ward, but a woman building a family, contributing to the community's future. Even Mary Crawford softened, arriving one day with a beautifully knitted baby blanket. "For the child," she said stiffly. "Every baby should have something soft." Eleanor accepted it with grace, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that she'd earned her place here through time and persistence. Spring arrived with a rush of green and life. The snow melted, revealing earth ready to be planted. Eleanor worked in the kitchen garden with increased energy, determined to establish a productive space before the baby came. Caleb worried about her overdoing it, but Eleanor waved off his concerns. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time while still working," she pointed out. "I'm not fragile." "I know you're not," Caleb said, "but humor me anyway. Let me worry about you." It was during one of these garden sessions that a rider appeared on the road to the ranch. Eleanor stood, shading her eyes, watching as the figure resolved into a man on a fine horse, too fine for a ranch hand or neighbor. Her stomach clenched with sudden fear. Something about the way he sat his horse, the quality of his clothes, sent alarm bells ringing. Caleb emerged from the barn, having seen the rider too. He came to stand beside Eleanor, his presence solid and reassuring. Together, they watched as the stranger approached, and Eleanor felt her entire world tilt on its axis when she recognized him. It was Marcus Thornton, the man her stepfather had chosen for her, the man she'd fled St. Louis to escape. He rode into the ranch yard with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, his gaze sweeping over the buildings before settling on Eleanor. Recognition flared in his eyes, followed by something that might have been satisfaction. "Eleanor Graves," he said, dismounting with practiced ease. "I've been looking for you." Caleb's hand found the small of Eleanor's back, a gesture of support and protection. "She's Eleanor Ward now," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "And this is private property. State your business or leave." Marcus's gaze shifted to Caleb, assessment clear in his eyes. "I'm Marcus Thornton from St. Louis. I've come to collect Miss Graves and return her to her family." "Mrs. Ward," Eleanor corrected, finding her voice, though it shook. "I'm married, Mr. Thornton, legally married. You have no claim on me." "Married?" Marcus's expression darkened. "A marriage entered into while you were running from legal obligations? I doubt it would stand up in court, my dear. Your stepfather has retained lawyers. You're still underage according to St. Louis law, and the marriage contract he signed on your behalf is legally binding." Terror gripped Eleanor's heart, She thought herself safe, thought the distance and her new name would protect her. But Marcus's presence proved how naive that hope had been. "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said, his voice like iron. "She's my wife, carrying my child, living on my land. Whatever contracts you think you have are worth less than the paper they're written on once a woman's legally married to someone else." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Pregnant? How convenient. Though I suppose we could question the paternity, given how quickly this marriage occurred after her flight." Caleb moved before Eleanor could stop him, crossing the distance to Marcus in 2 strides and grabbing the man's expensive coat. "You'll apologize to my wife," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Right now, or I'll throw you off my property and let the wolves have what's left." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. Whatever he'd expected to find in Wyoming, a frightened girl alone and vulnerable, he hadn't found. Instead, he'd encountered a woman with a protector who clearly meant every word of his threat. "This isn't over," Marcus said, straightening his coat once Caleb released him. "I'll return with the proper authorities. Your little frontier wedding won't stand against real law." He remounted and rode away, leaving Eleanor trembling in the ranch yard. She felt Caleb's arms come around her, holding her while shock and fear warred in her chest. "He can't take me back," she whispered. "Caleb, he can't. I won't go. I'd rather die." "He won't take you anywhere," Caleb said fiercely. "I promise you, Eleanor. I'll fight him in every court in the territory if I have to. You're my wife. You're carrying our child. No one is taking you from me." Mrs. Chen appeared from the house, her face grim. "I saw that fancy man from the window. Who was he?" "Trouble from my past," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Caleb, we need help. We need a lawyer. We need to make sure our marriage is uncontestable." "Then that's what we'll do," Caleb said. "Tomorrow, we ride to town. We'll talk to Judge Morrison, make sure every paper is filed properly, get testimony from everyone who witnessed our wedding. We'll build a case so strong that no St. Louis lawyer can touch it." They spent that night making plans, writing down everything they could remember, gathering documents. Eleanor told Caleb everything about her stepfather's arrangements, about the contracts and agreements that had been made without her knowledge or consent. It poured out of her in a torrent, all the details she'd been too frightened or ashamed to share before. Caleb listened to it all, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finally finished, he took her hands in his. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I married you because I wanted a partner, yes, but I fell in love with you because of who you are, your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. This baby we're expecting? That's a blessing I never expected, but treasure more than I can say." He paused, making sure she was really hearing him. "I would fight for you, even if there was no baby, even if we'd never shared a bed, even if we were still just 2 people learning to work together. You are worth fighting for, not because of what you bring me, but because of who you are." The words broke something open in Eleanor's chest, some last pocket of fear that she was only valued for her utility, that her worth was conditional. She threw her arms around Caleb's neck and held on tight, feeling his solid strength, his unwavering support. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much." "Then trust me," Caleb said. "Trust that we'll face this together. You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. You've got me, you've got Mrs. Chen, you've got every friend we've made in this territory. Marcus Thornton might have lawyers and money, but we have something stronger. We have right on our side. And we have each other." They held each other as night fell, and despite the fear gnawing at her heart, Eleanor felt a fierce determination building. She'd run once, but she wouldn't run again. This was her home. Caleb was her husband. The child growing inside her was her future. And she would fight with everything she had to protect all of it. Marcus Thornton had made a mistake coming here. He'd thought he'd find a frightened girl. Instead, he'd found a woman who'd discovered her own strength. And that woman wasn't going anywhere. Dawn broke cold and clear over Cedar Bluff Ranch, finding Eleanor already awake, her hand resting protectively over the small curve of her belly. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios and desperate plans. Beside her, Caleb stirred, and she felt his arm tighten around her waist. "Still worried?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What if Marcus comes back with a marshal? What if the law sides with him? Wyoming's not even a state yet. What power do our territorial laws have against contracts signed in Missouri? Caleb sat up, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. The morning light painted him in shades of gold, highlighting the determined set of his jaw. Then we fight. We document everything. We get testimonies. We make it impossible for anyone to claim you're not exactly where you choose to be. He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes intense. Eleanor, I've lost enough in my life. I'm not losing you. Not to Marcus Thornton, not to your stepfather, not to anyone. They dressed quickly and made the journey to Cedar Springs before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Judge Morrison, the same justice of the peace who'd married them, lived in a modest house behind the courthouse. His wife answered their knock, took one look at Eleanor's pale face, and immediately ushered them inside. The judge listened to their story over coffee, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. When Eleanor finished explaining about Marcus's visit and the threats he'd made, Judge Morrison sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is complicated," he said finally. "Missouri law versus Wyoming territorial law. Contracts signed by a guardian versus a marriage entered into freely. The fact that you're expecting a child helps. That establishes the marriage is consummated and genuine, not just a legal fiction. But if Thornton brings a good lawyer, then we need a better one," Caleb said firmly. "Judge, you know me. You know I'm not some predator who took advantage of a desperate woman. Eleanor came here seeking safety, and I offered her a partnership. Everything since has been her choice. I believe you, son. The question is whether a court will." Judge Morrison drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "We need to establish a paper trail showing Eleanor's agency. Witnesses to her state when she arrived, to the time she spent here before the marriage, to her clear consent and active participation in building a life here. We need to show this isn't a case of an innocent girl being manipulated, but of a woman making informed decisions about her own future." "Mrs. Chen," Eleanor said suddenly, "she was here from the beginning. She can testify to everything, how I arrived, how Caleb gave me time to decide, how I chose to stay." "Good start," the judge agreed. "We'll also need testimony from me about the marriage itself, from any neighbors who visited and seen you two together. The more people who can speak to your genuine partnership, the stronger your case." He paused, his expression sympathetic. "But Eleanor, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you might have to testify about why you ran, about what your stepfather did, what Marcus Thornton represented. It won't be pleasant." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. The thought of exposing her stepfather's cruelty, of admitting publicly how she'd been controlled and diminished, made her stomach turn. But the alternative, being dragged back to St. Louis, losing Caleb, losing her child, was unthinkable. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. They spent the morning in the judge's office, drafting affidavits and gathering documentation. Judge Morrison sent a clerk to round up the witnesses who'd been present at the wedding ceremony, taking formal statements from each. Mrs. Chen arrived mid-morning, summoned by Caleb's urgent message, and gave such a passionate testimony about Eleanor's character and the genuine nature of the marriage that even the usually stoic judge looked moved. "That girl arrived here half dead from running," Mrs. Chen said fiercely. "Caleb fed her and gave her shelter and asked nothing in return except honest work. I watched them for 2 weeks before they married, and I saw two people learning to respect each other, to value each other. What they have is real, Judge. As real as any marriage I've seen in 40 years of living." By noon, they had a thick file of documents, marriage certificate, witness testimonies, letters from neighbors attesting to Eleanor's good character and the obvious genuine affection between her and Caleb. Judge Morrison promised to file everything with the territorial governor's office, creating an official record that would be hard to dispute. "One more thing," the judge said as they prepared to leave. "I'm going to write to a colleague in Cheyenne, Jacob Finch. He's the best lawyer in the territory, used to practice in Boston before he came west. If Thornton brings lawyers, we'll need someone who can match them argument for argument." "Thank you," Eleanor said, gripping the judge's hand. "Thank you for believing us." "I believe in the law," Judge Morrison corrected gently. "And the law says a married woman's husband is her guardian, not her stepfather. We just need to make sure that point is abundantly clear." They returned to the ranch to find Marcus Thornton waiting in the yard, this time accompanied by 2 men, One wore a marshal's badge, the other the expensive suit of a lawyer. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine, but Caleb's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Mr. Ward, Mrs. Ward," the marshal said, his tone professionally neutral. "I'm Marshal Davies. This here is Mr. Thornton and his attorney, Mr. Carlyle from St. Louis. They've brought some serious allegations that need addressing." "Then let's address them," Caleb said calmly, though Eleanor could feel the tension in his frame. "Would you like to come inside, or shall we discuss this in the yard?" "Inside would be proper," Mr. Carlyle said, his Eastern accent crisp and condescending. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and the kind of polished appearance that came from never doing a day's manual labor. His eyes swept over Eleanor with cold assessment. "Miss Graves, I'm here representing your stepfather, Mr. Howard Graves. He's been quite worried about you." "It's Mrs. Ward," Eleanor corrected, her voice stronger than she felt. "And I find it hard to believe my stepfather is worried about anything except his business arrangement with Mr. Thornton." They settled in the main room, Eleanor and Caleb on one side, Marcus and his lawyer on the other, with Marshal Davies positioned neutrally between. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen, took one look at the assembled group, and planted herself in a chair near Eleanor, a silent guardian. Mr. Carlyle opened a leather case and pulled out documents. "Let's review the facts, shall we? Eleanor Graves, age 19, daughter of the late Helen Graves, ward of Mr. Howard Graves following her mother's death. In August of last year, Mr. Graves, in his capacity as legal guardian, entered into a marriage contract with Mr. Marcus Thornton here. The contract was properly witnessed and filed with the state of Missouri." "A contract I never consented to," Eleanor interjected. "A contract signed without my knowledge or agreement." "Your consent wasn't legally required," Mr. Carlyle said smoothly. "As your guardian, Mr. Graves had full authority to make such decisions on your behalf until you reached your majority at age 21. "That might be true in Missouri," Caleb said, his voice hard. "But Eleanor married me of her own free will in Wyoming territory. Our marriage supersedes any contract made without her consent." "Does it?" Mr. Carlyle's smile was sharp. "You married on October 15th, quite quickly after Miss Graves's arrival, I understand. Some might say suspiciously quickly. Some might say a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage has every right to seek protection however she can," Mrs. Chen snapped. "And if you're suggesting Caleb took advantage, you didn't see how he gave her time, gave her choices, treated her with more respect than any of you St. Louis fancy men ever did." Marshal Davies held up a hand. "Let's keep this civil, folks. Mr. Carlyle, you've presented your case. Now let's hear the other side." Caleb pulled out the folder they'd assembled that morning, spreading documents across the table. "Eleanor arrived here on October 1st. I gave her work and shelter for 2 weeks before we ever discussed marriage. Judge Morrison, who married us, has provided testimony that Eleanor freely consented to the marriage after that trial period. We have witnesses who can attest to the genuine nature of our relationship." "How convenient," Marcus said, speaking for the first time. His voice dripped with disdain. "You've had months to manufacture evidence and coach witnesses. The fact remains that Eleanor ran from a legal obligation. She stole money. Money that belonged to my mother," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. "Money held in trust that my stepfather was managing. I took what was rightfully mine." "That's not how the law sees it," Mr. Carlyle said. "The trust was under Mr. Graves's control until you reached majority or married with his approval. By taking that money and fleeing, you committed theft." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor felt her world tilting. She'd never thought of herself as a thief, but technically, legally, had she stolen? "Even if that were true," Caleb said, his voice dangerous, "it doesn't give you the right to invalidate our marriage. Eleanor is my wife. She's carrying my child. Under territorial law, I am now her legal guardian, not her stepfather. Any contracts he signed on her behalf are void." "Unless the marriage itself is invalid," Mr. Carlyle countered. "If it can be proven that Miss Graves entered into the marriage under duress, or that the marriage was undertaken to evade legal obligations, it could be annulled, at which point the original contract would stand." Eleanor felt the room spin. Annulled. They wanted to erase her marriage, erase everything she'd built, Take her back to St. Louis and Marcus Thornton's cold eyes and her stepfather's controlling grip. No, she said, the word coming out fiercer than she'd intended. No, I won't let you do this. She stood, forcing herself to meet Marcus's gaze directly. You want to know why I ran? Fine, I'll tell you. My stepfather spent 5 years controlling every aspect of my life. Who I saw, where I went, what I read, what I said. After my mother died, he got worse. He told me I was fortunate anyone would want me, that I should be grateful Mr. Thornton was willing to overlook my deficiencies. Eleanor, you don't have to, Caleb started, but she shook her head. Yes, I do. She turned to Marshall Davies. When my stepfather told me about the marriage contract, I tried to refuse. He locked me in my room for 3 days. No food, barely any water. He said I was hysterical, that I needed time to see reason. When he finally let me out, I pretended to agree. I smiled and nodded and played the obedient daughter while I planned my escape. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words pouring out like poison being drawn from a wound. The night before the wedding, I looked at the man my stepfather expected me to marry. Mr. Thornton examined me like livestock. He discussed my breeding potential with my stepfather as if I wasn't even in the room. He talked about how he'd manage me, control my spending, ensure I didn't embarrass him socially, and I realized that if I married him, I would disappear. Not literally. I'd still be alive, still be breathing, but everything that made me Eleanor would be crushed out, replaced by whatever version of myself they wanted. She turned back to Marcus, seeing him clearly now, not as the threat he'd seemed, but as exactly what he was. A man who viewed women as commodities. So yes, I ran. I stole money and I ran, and I ended up here. And Caleb offered me something neither you nor my stepfather ever did. A choice. He gave me 2 weeks to decide what I wanted. He offered partnership, not ownership. He saw me as a person, not property. Eleanor moved to stand beside Caleb, taking his hand. I married him freely. I stay with him freely. I'm carrying his child by choice, not coercion. And no contract signed by my stepfather, no lawyer from St. Louis, no law made by men who think women are possessions. None of that will make me go back. The silence that followed was profound. Even Mr. Carlyle looked momentarily unsettled by the passion in Eleanor's voice. Marshall Davies was studying her intently, his expression thoughtful. Miss Graves, Marcus began. Mrs. Ward, Eleanor corrected sharply. Mrs. Ward, Marcus said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. I understand you felt pressured. Perhaps the engagement could have been handled more delicately. But running away, creating this situation, it's made everything more complicated. If you simply come back to St. Louis, we can discuss things properly. Perhaps delay the wedding, give you more time. I don't want more time, Eleanor said. I don't want to discuss it. I don't want anything except to be left alone to live my life with the man I chose to marry. The man who conveniently appeared to save you? Mr. Carlyle asked skeptically. Mrs. Ward, forgive me, but this all seems rather orchestrated. A desperate woman appears at a lonely rancher's door, and within weeks they're married? It has all the hallmarks of a marriage of convenience designed specifically to evade your legal obligations. It was convenient, Caleb said, surprising everyone. Eleanor needed safety, and I needed a partner. We were honest about that from the start. But convenience doesn't mean it's not real. He stood, moving to wrap an arm around Eleanor's shoulders. I've been in love, Marshall. I've courted a woman properly, with flowers and poetry and all the romantic gestures. You know what? It wasn't real. It was a performance. What I have with Eleanor is real precisely because we didn't start with illusions. We started with honesty and built from there. He looked down at Eleanor, and the tenderness in his expression made her breath catch. She's my partner in every sense. She works beside me every day. She's smarter than me about half the things we discuss and isn't afraid to say so. She's brave and strong and stubborn as hell. I didn't rescue her. She rescued herself, and then she let me be part of rebuilding her life. That's not convenience. That's choosing each other every single day. Marshall Davies cleared his throat. That's a real pretty speech, Mr. Ward. But I need to deal in facts, not feelings. Here's what I see. A young woman with a legal obligation in Missouri, a marriage that happened mighty fast, and a lot of he said, she said about consent and coercion. He turned to Mr. Carlyle. What exactly are you asking me to do here? We want Mrs. Ward to return to Sinhetz. Lewis, for a proper hearing, Mr. Carlyle said, let a Missouri court determine the validity of the marriage and whether Mrs. Ward's obligations under the original contract still stand. Absolutely not, Caleb said flatly. You're not taking her anywhere. Mr. Ward, I understand your feelings, but— No, you don't understand, Caleb interrupted, his voice rising. You don't understand what it's like to watch someone you love be treated like property. You don't understand what it means to build a life with someone based on mutual respect and trust. And you sure as hell don't understand that I will do whatever it takes to protect my wife and child. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Marshal Davies stood, his hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. Let's all stay calm now. Nobody's taking anybody anywhere today. This is a complex legal matter that needs sorting out properly. Thank God someone is being reasonable, Marcus muttered. Mrs. Chen, who'd been silent until now, suddenly stood. Reasonable? You want reasonable? I'll give you reasonable. I've been in this territory 30 years. I've seen women treated like cattle, bought and sold with no say in their own lives. I've also seen the law change, seen women start to get rights they never had before. And I'll tell you something. Any law that says a girl can be locked in a room and starved until she agrees to marry a man she doesn't want, that's not a law worth respecting. The law is the law, Mr. Carlyle said stiffly. Then maybe it's a bad law, Mrs. Chen shot back. Eleanor Ward is standing here telling you she's happy, she's married, she's building a life. What more do you need? Evidence that the marriage is valid under Missouri law, Mr. Carlyle said. And currently, I'm not convinced it is. The argument might have continued indefinitely, if not for a knock at the door. Caleb moved to answer it, revealing Judge Morrison accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver-streaked dark hair and keen gray eyes. Judge, Caleb said with obvious relief, you got here fast. Got your message and came straight away, Judge Morrison said, stepping inside. And I brought Jacob Finch, the lawyer I mentioned. Jacob, this is Caleb and Eleanor Ward. Jacob Finch moved into the room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power he wielded. His eyes swept over the assembled group, lingering for a moment on Mr. Carlyle, with something that might have been recognition or might have been disdain. Carlyle, he said with a slight nod. Still practicing in Missouri, I see. Finch, Mr. Carlyle responded, and Eleanor heard wariness in his voice. I didn't know you'd moved to Wyoming. 5 years ago. Turns out the West suits me better than Boston. Jacob set down his briefcase and pulled out papers. Judge Morrison brought me up to speed on the situation. I've had a chance to review the documents, and I have some thoughts. He turned to Marshal Davies. First, Marshal, I want to clarify something. You have no authority to compel Mrs. Ward to leave Wyoming Territory. Missouri might have issued a warrant, though I notice Mr. Carlyle hasn't produced one. But even if they had, Wyoming isn't obligated to honor it in a civil matter like this. The contract, Mr. Carlyle began, is void, Jacob interrupted smoothly. Wyoming Territory recognized women's suffrage last year, Marshal. We were the first territory to do so. That means women here have legal rights that supersede contracts made by male guardians in other states. Mrs. Ward is a resident of Wyoming, married under Wyoming law, and as such, her marriage is valid regardless of what Missouri law might say about prior contracts. Eleanor felt hope flare in her chest. Is that true? Completely true, Jacob confirmed. Wyoming's laws are actually some of the most progressive in the nation regarding women's rights. Your stepfather's guardianship ended the moment you became a legal resident here and married. The contract he signed with Mr. Thornton has no standing in this territory. Mr. Carlyle's face had gone red. That's a radical interpretation of the law. It's the correct interpretation, Jacob said calmly. And if you'd like to challenge it, we can take it before a territorial court. I'm confident Judge Morrison would be happy to preside. He turned to the judge, who nodded firmly. Happy to, Judge Morrison confirmed. And I'll tell you right now how I'd rule. A woman who enters into marriage freely, who's been living as a wife for months, who's expecting a child, that marriage is valid, period. I don't care what contracts were signed in Missouri. They don't apply here. Marcus had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this exchange. Now he stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Eleanor, be reasonable. You can't possibly want to stay in this godforsaken wilderness, living like a peasant when you could come back to civilization. This is civilization, Eleanor said quietly. Maybe not your civilization with its fancy houses and its rules that say women are property, but it's a civilization where I have a voice, where I have choices, where I'm valued for who I am, not what I bring to a business arrangement. She moved closer to Caleb, drawing strength from his solid presence. I'm not going back, Marcus. Not now, not ever. Your stepfather won't give up, Marcus said, his voice hardening. He has resources. He'll fight this. Let him fight, Caleb said. We'll fight back. And we have something he doesn't. We have the truth on our side. Marshal Davies looked between the two lawyers, then at Eleanor and Caleb, clearly trying to work out his position. Finally, he sighed. Here's how I see it. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. Mrs. Zell, Ward isn't under arrest, and I've got no cause to detain her. If Missouri wants to pursue this legally, they can file with the territorial court. Until then, she stays where she is. Marshal, I must protest, Mr. Carlyle began. Protest all you want, the marshal said, clearly tired of the whole situation. But I'm not dragging a pregnant woman away from her husband without a direct order from a judge, and so far, I haven't seen one. He turned to Marcus and Mr. Carlyle. Gentlemen, I suggest you head back to town. If you want to pursue this further, do it through proper legal channels. For a moment, Eleanor thought Marcus might argue further. His face was tight with frustration, and she could see him calculating whether to push harder or retreat. Finally, he grabbed his hat. This isn't over, he said, directing the words at Eleanor. Your stepfather will pursue this to the highest court if necessary. Then he'll lose, Eleanor said, with a confidence she was only starting to feel. Because I'm not coming back, ever. After Marcus, Mr. Carlyle, and the marshal departed, the tension in the room slowly dissipated. Eleanor found herself shaking with reaction, and Caleb immediately guided her to a chair. Easy, he murmured. It's over. For now, at least. Is it really? Eleanor looked up at Jacob Finch. Can my stepfather really pursue this further? He can try, Jacob said honestly, but his case is weak and getting weaker by the day. Every day you remain married, every witness who testifies to the genuine nature of your relationship, every document we file, it all builds an insurmountable case that this is a valid marriage entered into freely. By the time your child is born, it'll be impossible to argue otherwise. What about the theft charge? Caleb asked. The money Eleanor took was from her mother's trust, which her stepfather was managing but which legally belonged to Eleanor, Jacob said. At worst, it's a civil dispute over trust management. At best, Eleanor was simply taking what was rightfully hers. Either way, it's not criminal, and it's certainly not grounds to annul a marriage. Judge Morrison poured coffee for everyone, and they spent the next hour going over strategy. Jacob would file formal documentation with the territorial government establishing Eleanor's residency and the validity of her marriage. He would also send letters to Eleanor's stepfather and his lawyers, making clear that Wyoming Territory did not recognize contracts that violated a woman's right to choose her own husband. It's possible they'll still try to pursue this, Jacob warned. Howard Graves sounds like a man who doesn't like losing, but every legal avenue will cost him money and time, and he'll be fighting Wyoming law. Most likely he'll eventually decide it's not worth the effort. And if he doesn't? Eleanor asked. Then we fight him in court and we win, Jacob said simply. I've read your testimony, Mrs. Ward. I've seen the evidence of your marriage. If this goes before a judge, you'll win. I guarantee it. After the judge and Jacob left, promising to be in touch with updates, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves alone with Mrs. Chen. The older woman looked at Eleanor with something that might have been pride. You did good today, she said, standing up to them like that, telling your truth. I was terrified, Eleanor admitted. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Mrs. Chen said. It means being scared and doing it anyway. She patted Eleanor's hand. You're going to be fine, girl, both of you. That baby you're carrying is going to grow up knowing their mother is a fighter. After Mrs. Chen left, Eleanor and Caleb stood together in the suddenly quiet house. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting everything gold, and Eleanor felt the tension that had been coiling in her chest for days finally begin to loosen. I think we actually might be okay, she said wonderingly. We're more than okay, Caleb said, pulling her into his arms. We're together, we're legal, and we have an entire territory's laws protecting us. Eleanor, you did it. You stood up to them, and you won. We won, Eleanor corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. They held each other as the sun set, and Eleanor felt the last pieces of her old life finally falling away. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing her ground, fighting for the life she'd chosen, refusing to be diminished or controlled. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of peace. Marcus and his lawyer left Wyoming, returning to St. Louis with their tails between their legs. Jacob sent regular updates. Howard Graves had indeed hired more lawyers, but they were encountering exactly the obstacles Jacob had predicted. Wyoming's laws were clear, and Eleanor's marriage was valid. The lawyers advised Howard that pursuing the matter further would be expensive and likely futile. Spring gave way to summer, and Eleanor's pregnancy became obvious to anyone who looked. She bloomed in the warm weather, her body changing in ways that sometimes alarmed her, but that Caleb found endlessly fascinating. He was protective without being suffocating, worried without being controlling, and his excitement about the coming baby was so genuine it made Eleanor fall more in love with him every day. The community's acceptance grew as Eleanor's pregnancy progressed. Women who'd been skeptical softened when they saw how carefully Caleb tended to his wife, how Eleanor continued working even as her belly swelled, how the two of them built a life of genuine partnership. Even Mary Crawford unbent enough to bring more baby clothes and offer advice about childbirth. "You've made a place here," she said to Eleanor one afternoon as they shelled peas together on the porch. "That's no small thing. This territory chews up people who don't have the strength for it, but you've got that strength." In July, word came from Jacob that Howard Graves had formally withdrawn his legal challenge. The cost and complexity of pursuing a case across territorial lines, combined with Jacob's aggressive legal responses and Judge Morrison's clear stance, had convinced him to cut his losses. Eleanor was legally and irrevocably Eleanor Ward, with no shadow of her past hanging over her future. She cried when Caleb read her the letter, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than sorrow. That night, they rode out to Eden's Hollow, the beautiful valley Caleb had told her about months ago. He helped her down from the horse, careful of her swollen belly, and they walked through the tall grass together. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, his voice carrying a nervousness Eleanor rarely heard, "about this place, about what it could be." "What do you mean?" He stopped and turned to face her, the setting sun painting him in shades of gold and amber. "I mean, this is the prettiest piece of land on the whole ranch. Good water, shelter from the wind, soil that would grow just about anything. I've always thought if I ever had a family, I'd build a house here. A real house, bigger than the one we've got now, a place where we could raise children and watch them run through this grass and know they're safe and free." Eleanor's breath caught. "Caleb, I know we've got the ranch house," he said quickly, "and it's fine. But this place, Eleanor, it feels like a new beginning. Like we could build something here that's entirely ours, not tied to my past or my grief. Just us and our future." He dropped to one knee in the grass, and Eleanor realized with shock that he was holding a small box. When he opened it, sunlight caught on a delicate gold band set with small diamonds. "I know we're already married," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "But that was about survival and paperwork and legal protection. This is about something else. Eleanor Ward, you're my partner, my best friend, the mother of my child, and the love of my life. I want to ask you properly this time, not because either of us needs to, but because I want to. Will you marry me again? Will you build a life with me here in Eden's Hollow and let me spend every day trying to deserve you?" Eleanor was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. "You already deserve me," she managed. "You saved me, Caleb. Not just from Marcus and my stepfather, but from a life where I'd never have known who I really was or what I was capable of. You gave me room to become myself." "Is that a yes?" Caleb asked with a smile. "That's a yes," Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you again. Yes, I'll build a house with you. Yes to everything." He slipped the ring onto her finger beside his mother's wedding band, and when he stood, he pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promises and sunset and home. They stood together in the waving grass as the sky turned pink and orange and purple, and Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "What should we call it?" she asked, leaning back against his chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her and their growing child. "Our new house?" "I was thinking new beginnings," Caleb said, "or fresh start, something that acknowledges what we've both overcome to get here." "What about Hope House?" Eleanor suggested. "Because that's what you gave me when I had none left. And that's what we're building, a place where hope lives." "Hope House," Caleb repeated, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Yeah, I like that. Hope House at Eden's Hollow." They stayed until the stars emerged, talking about the future they'd build together. A house with a real parlor where Eleanor could teach children to read. A big kitchen with windows overlooking the valley. Bedrooms for the family they'd raise. Gardens and orchards, and all the things that turned a piece of land into a home. Eleanor's labor came in late August, heralded by a sunrise so beautiful it seemed orchestrated specifically for the occasion. Mrs. Chen arrived within an hour of Caleb's urgent summons, took one look at Eleanor, and immediately took charge. She sent Caleb out of the house with strict instructions not to return until called, despite his protests. "Birthing babies is women's work," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You'll just pace and worry and get in the way. Go check on the cattle. Go mend a fence. Go anywhere but here." The labor was long and difficult, testing Eleanor's strength in ways she'd never imagined. Mrs. Chen was there throughout, her hands capable and her voice steady, guiding Eleanor through each contraction with the wisdom of someone who'd delivered dozens of babies. "That's it," she'd say. "Breathe through it. You're strong enough for this." Almost there now. When Eleanor's daughter finally arrived, screaming her indignation at being thrust into the cold world, Eleanor felt something break open in her chest. The midwife placed the tiny, red-faced baby on Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor looked down at her daughter's scrunched-up face and knew, with absolute certainty, that everything she'd gone through had been worth it for this moment. "She's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Chen cleaned up efficiently, then went to fetch Caleb. When he burst into the room, his face was pale with worry that transformed to wonder when he saw Eleanor propped up in bed, their daughter nursing at her breast. Are you—" He couldn't seem to finish a sentence. "We're fine," Eleanor said, smiling at his obvious terror and joy mixed together. "Come meet your daughter." Caleb approached the bed like he was approaching something sacred. When Eleanor placed the baby in his arms, showing him how to support her head, he looked down at his daughter with such pure love that Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your papa, and that amazing woman there is your mama. And we're going to love you and protect you and make sure you grow up knowing you can be anything you want to be." "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked. They discussed names endlessly over the past months, never quite settling on one. But now, looking at their daughter's face, Caleb said, "Hope. We should name her Hope, because she's the living embodiment of everything we fought for." "Hope Eleanor Ward," Eleanor said, testing it. "It's perfect." The rest of that day passed in a blur of visitors and well-wishes. Mrs. Chen spread the word, and neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon with gifts and advice and congratulations. Even Sarah Blackwood came, bringing a beautifully embroidered baby blanket and an apology that was clearly difficult for her to make. "I was wrong about you," she said to Eleanor, who was tired enough to be generous. "About both of you. You've built something real here. I can see that now. I hope you'll both be very happy." As the sun set on Hope's first day in the world, Eleanor lay in bed with her daughter sleeping in a cradle beside her, and Caleb stretched out on the bed beside them. They watched their baby sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way her mouth moved in her sleep, as if nursing in her dreams. "Can you believe this is our life?" Eleanor asked softly. 6 months ago, I was running across Wyoming, desperate and afraid. Now look at us." "I can believe it," Caleb said, taking her hand, "because I watched you fight for it every single day. You could have given up so many times, when Marcus showed up, when the lawyers came, when things got hard, but you didn't. You stood your ground, and you fought for the life you wanted." "We fought for it," Eleanor corrected. "Together." They fell asleep like that, the three of them, a family forged not through obligation or arrangement, but through choice and courage and love that had grown from honest soil. The years that followed brought their share of challenges: hard winters and dry summers, calves lost to predators, and fences needing constant repair, the endless work of running a ranch. But they also brought joy beyond measure. Hope grew into a spirited child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. A son followed 2 years later, James Caleb Ward, named for the brother Caleb had lost. Then another daughter, Helen Grace, named for Eleanor's mother. They built Hope House at Eden's Hollow, just as they'd planned. It rose slowly, built with their own hands and the help of neighbors who'd become true friends. The house was large and warm, with the parlor Eleanor had dreamed of, where she taught not just her own children, but the children of nearby ranches to read and write and think critically about the world. Eleanor never heard from her stepfather again. According to letters from old acquaintances in St. Louis, Howard Graves had remarried within a year of Eleanor's departure, a widow with money of her own who apparently gave him as good as she got. Marcus Thornton had also remarried, to a railroad baron's daughter, who, rumor had it, kept him on a very short leash. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in these reports, just a distant relief that those chapters of her life had closed completely. Cedar Bluff Ranch prospered under Eleanor and Caleb's joint management. Eleanor's education and organizational skills proved invaluable in managing accounts and negotiating contracts, while Caleb's understanding of the land and cattle made the operation successful even in difficult years. They became known throughout the territory as partners in the truest sense, and more than one young couple looked to them as an example of what marriage could be when entered into with respect and equality. On Hope's 10th birthday, Eleanor stood on the porch of Hope House, watching her children play in the grass of Eden's Hollow. The valley was green and alive, just as beautiful as that first evening Caleb had brought her here. The house behind her was filled with laughter and love, with books and music and the thousand small joys that made a house a home. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "About the girl who stumbled into your ranch yard 10 years ago," Eleanor said, leaning back against him. "Desperate and afraid and running from everything. I can hardly remember what that felt like now." "You were never just desperate and afraid," Caleb said. "You were also brave and determined and stronger than you knew. I saw that the moment I met you." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back every single day for 10 years. His face showed the marks of time and hard living, but his eyes were still that impossible blue, and they still looked at her like she was something precious. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become who I was meant to be." "Thank you for taking that chance," Caleb replied, and kissed her as their children's laughter echoed across the valley, and the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Eleanor Graves had fled St. Louis with nothing but fear and desperation. But Eleanor Ward had built something far more valuable than safety. She'd built a life of her own choosing, filled with work that mattered, and love that sustained, and the deep satisfaction of knowing she'd fought for every bit of happiness she'd found. She'd run from a life that would have crushed her, and she'd run straight into the arms of a man who'd offered not rescue, but partnership. Together, they'd built more than a ranch or a house or a family. They'd built proof that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose themselves, and that from that single act of courage, entire futures can unfold. The Wyoming sun set over Eden's Hollow, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. And Eleanor Ward stood on her porch, surrounded by everything she'd fought for and everything she'd become. And it was good. It was so very, very good.